You've Got to Kiss the Girl by Laura Hile. Narrated by Ruth Redman. It is a truth, universally acknowledged, that a widow in possession of a large estate often has something to be crabby about. For Lady Catherine de Bourgh of Rosings Park, this was very much the case today. In a matter of weeks, Easter would be here, which meant the presence of her nephews. Would this be the year Darcy announced his engagement to Lady Catherine's only daughter? She already knew the answer. For the past decade she had hinted, suggested, nagged, cajoled, even commanded him. But did Darcy propose to Anne? No. The man was just as stubborn as his father, and Lady Catherine's late husband, and her own father as well. Men, Lady Catherine decided, were too pig-headed for their own good. "This was your mother's dying wish," she told Darcy on more than one occasion. Just because Lady Catherine was not present at her sister's bedside to hear her say so did not make it any less true. No one understood the heart of a woman like a sister. "It was a wish expressed in younger days," she told him, "as together your mother and I sat beside Anne's cradle." "One lives to repent the follies committed in youth," was Darcy's response. "No doubt my mother did the same." Stupid boy! Although he was no longer a boy, he was a man of 28. It was high time Darcy was married. To Anne. Lady Catherine's troubles were compounded by her rector, Mr. Collins, and his new wife. Why must Mrs. Collins's guests arrive just now? She ought to have consulted Lady Catherine before inviting her sister and her friend, but she hadn't. Never again would such a thing be permitted. Lady Catherine would make certain of that. Oh, Mrs. Collins's sister was harmless enough. Trouble took the form of the friend, one Elizabeth Bennet. The thought of her caused Lady Catherine's fingers to curl into claws. There was no use denying it. Miss Bennet, the daughter of an obscure country gentleman, was a beauty. Moreover, she was conversant enough to be charming. Darcy would not arrive for another fortnight, but Lady Catherine knew what would happen. Darcy, and Colonel Fitzwilliam too, would be captivated. With such loveliness to distract him, what hope had Anne of securing Darcy's heart? None at all. Well, she would speak to Darcy again about his duty and demand that he take action. Her nephew's stated purpose in coming to Rosings Park was to oversee estate business, as though she and her bailiff were incapable. To this end, Lady Catherine's writing table was covered with files for Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam to examine. One particular file, whose cover was stained with age, caught her eye. Another year gone, and yet her agent had again failed to find a buyer for the moorland house. What had her husband been thinking when he'd taken this property as payment for a debt? And then, instead of including it in the properties willed to Anne, Lewis had left it to her. A stone house on an island in the middle of a lake. The moor was known for bogs and tors, not lakes. And yet here was this lake, deep and cold, right in the middle of the moor, with a solitary house, empty for years, that no one wished to buy. Lady Catherine pushed the file aside. She would discuss with her nephews the possibility of giving it to the Crown. In this way she would be rid of the expense of maintenance and taxes. A clock chimed the hour. Mr. and Mrs. Collins and their guests were not coming this evening. A welcome respite. Miss Bennet's vivacious good health was an unhappy contrast to Anne's listlessness. If only Anne would exert herself a little, her health would improve. Speaking of health, the afternoon was fine. What better way to spend it than to stroll in the garden? She might as well. She paid an army of men to keep it in splendid form. But Lady Catherine's temper did not improve. For on a bench in the rose garden she discovered an abandoned book. Such slackness! This was what came from permitting guests to have access to the gardens. Rubbishy novels left lying about. She took up the volume and opened it. The name inscribed on the flyleaf, Clark's Subscription Library, meant nothing to her, nor was the title one she recognised. Father's Frustration, a Neapolitan tale of intrigue, abduction, and marriage of convenience. Naples was located in Italy. Lady Catherine knew that. It would have to be if an abduction took place. All sorts of ridiculous things happened in Italy. She studied the title with compressed lips. Father's Frustration, was it? She knew the feeling. Her fingertips ruffled the pages. Since the story was about parents, perhaps she should take a look. She settled herself on the bench and turned to the first page. Skipping over the preface, these were always so dreary, she began to read. I cannot understand it, Francesco. She has everything, my daughter. Beauty, a fortune, an expansive estate to inherit. And my son, what does he lack? His face rivals our Roman gods. He possesses not one estate but two. Wealth and intelligence and honour are his. Why does she not accept him? Why does he not propose? For 5 years we have waited. They know their duty, and yet nothing. Within a week, Letitia attains her majority, and you know what that means. The years of danger. They must marry. An important alliance hangs in the balance. It is up to us, Gaetano. We must do something. But what? How can a father compel his offspring to marry? We have been patient long enough. We must take matters into our own hands. Behind Francesco's pointed beard, a smile grew. It is not for nothing that we share the blood of the Bourges, my cousin. Gaetano's eyes widened, and then he too began to smile. Not for nothing indeed. What did you have in mind? Lady Catherine lowered the book. Her heart was fluttering in a most unusual way. A sound caught her attention, and she looked up. Was that a bird flying by? Or could it be the flutter of angels' wings? Nonsense! The Almighty had better things to do than to waste his time with novels. Even so, it was with reluctance that Lady Catherine closed the book. And later, when she returned to the house, she was careful to conceal it in the folds of her skirt. This was one novel she simply must read. Those fathers, they were up to something. Lady Catherine was suddenly desperate to know what it was. Perhaps this book held the answer to her dilemma about Anne. Chapter 2. That night Lady Catherine retired early. When at last she reached the final page of Father's Frustration, the clock was striking 3. It mattered little that her eyes were sore from strain, for the print was small. Her mind was alive with conjecture. Yes, this story offered much to think about. The abduction did take place, with the hero and heroine waking up in an isolated house together and alone. Over the course of a week, they were forced to depend upon one another for survival. Never mind that their eventual escape was secretly abetted by the fathers. By then, the two had fallen in love. The excuse for the marriage was propriety, but it was a love match just the same. This was proven by a cousin who stepped forward to marry the girl. Letitia would have none of it, and when her beloved fought him off, she rewarded him with a lover's kiss. A most satisfying conclusion. For one thing, a love match promised grandchildren. This was a prime objective for the Neapolitan fathers, but Lady Catherine now discovered that she too was keen to have a grandchild. Anne needn't exert herself to raise it, but surely she was strong enough to become a mother. Then, too, if Darcy loved her, he would not limit himself to duty. If he loved her. Surely Anne could be lovable, if only she would make the effort. As for Anne's heart, it would not be difficult to love a handsome man like Darcy. Even Lady Catherine could see that. Thoughts were spinning, so many thoughts. It was useless to remain in bed. She must act. Lady Catherine pulled on her dressing gown and a pair of slippers, hunted up a fresh candle, and left the bedchamber. Down through the darkened house she crept. When she reached her writing table, she pounced on the file. Here was the key to her plan. The lonely Moor house. For she did have a plan. One that involved intrigue and manipulation and abduction. The book spelled it all out for her. Who would suspect? This was England, for goodness sake. Kidnappings were the stuff of Gothic romances, not everyday life. A lonely house, isolated from the modern world, surely existed closer to home, but most were within easy reach of neighbouring farms. Lady Catherine was fortunate enough to own one that was not. She sat behind the desk and pulled forward a sheet of paper. She would list her ideas, commit them to memory, and then burn the page. In no way could she be connected with this scheme. Darcy would eventually realise that she had a hand in it, if he remembered the existence of the Moor house, which she doubted. But by then it would be too late. She twitched open the file and sifted through its contents. Grimstone, the house was called. No wonder the agent could not sell it. There was even a drawing of the house. Whomever she hired to seize Darcy and Anne by force, just the thought made Lady Catherine shiver, would find this useful. At length she closed the file. Darcy would dislike her thoroughly for what she was about to do, but did it matter? One never had much affection for one's relations. Lady Catherine hadn't liked any of her aunts or uncles. In time, as Darcy's love for Anne grew, he would come to forgive her. But if not, one must be willing to make sacrifices for the benefit of posterity. As to the abduction becoming known, there was nothing to fear. Darcy, like his father, was an intensely private man. Never would he share the truth with anyone. It would be too embarrassing. Lady Catherine discovered that she was smiling. Where to begin? With a letter to her solicitor, of course. Surely Mr. Hargreaves or Mr. Matthews knew of a firm that could handle the unsavoury details. Men would do almost anything for money, particularly if they were lawyers. After breakfast, she would send an express to London. Never had she been so thankful for London's easy distance, a mere 25 miles. Once she engaged a firm to handle the arrangements, the post would be preferable for correspondence. Did ruffians hire reputable couriers? Of course not. Why tempt an unscrupulous messenger with a view of the Rosings estate? After Darcy and Anne were taken, she would hire on extra guards. Yes, after a kidnapping, such an action would be thought prudent. Of next importance was the fitting up of Grimstone House. It must be not only well provisioned, but also dry and warm for Anne. There was no sense in forcing her to marry Darcy, only to later die of pneumonia. Lady Catherine counted off the days. In precisely 2 weeks, Darcy was due to arrive. He and Colonel Fitzwilliam would remain for 3 more. Before that time, everything at Grimstone House must be in place. This was a near impossible task, for even the simplest household repairs always took an age to complete. Without being present to scold and instruct, how could Lady Catherine motivate the workmen? The answer came at once. She would offer a bonus, large enough to be tempting, to ensure that the work would be finished on time. The thought of the money she must spend brought a sigh. There would certainly be banking matters to attend to, and these Lady Catherine must handle herself. It could not be helped, for none of the de Bourgh money must be used. And yet she was willing to free up the funds from her own fortune. This was a noble investment. The future of her family line was at stake. 5 weeks. They would have to be enough. Chapter 3. After an interminable meal, Lady Catherine pushed back her chair and rose to her feet. Mr. Darcy politely followed suit, and so did Colonel Fitzwilliam. Mrs. Jenkinson, hovering over Anne, escorted her tenderly from the dining-room. As soon as the door swung shut, Darcy heard his cousin sigh. He came to Darcy's end of the table and cast himself into a chair. "Have you your timepiece? I've forgotten mine." Darcy drew it out and pushed it along the polished tabletop. Fitz reached instead for the wine bottle and filled Darcy's glass and his own. It was now Darcy's turn to sigh. More wine was the last thing he needed. "Are we to be concerned with the time?" "I'm just wondering how long we can hide ourselves in here before we must go into the drawing-room." Darcy understood Fitz's reluctance. Aunt Catherine would doubtless prose on, with the irksome assumption that both of them agreed with her opinions. Darcy found it prudent to say as little as possible. This always made for a trying evening. "I was hoping," Fitz went on, "that tonight the rector and his guests would be asked to dine." Darcy was betrayed into a smile. "One guest in particular?" "Well, yes. Miss Bennet would be a treat for the eyes. All week we've had only Aunt Catherine and dreary Mrs. Jenkinson and Anne. You do realise that when Miss Bennet comes, Collins must come too." Fitz did not bother to hide a grimace. "Such a fellow! Where did our aunt find him? One would think she'd bestow the living on a sensible man." Ah, but a sensible man would not be nearly as grateful as Collins, nor as eager to agree with her every statement. "Does the man never stop talking?" "I fear not. Miss Elizabeth Bennet is hindered by, shall we say, unfortunate relations." "There are others? The poor girl!" Darcy looked an answer, but said nothing more. Indeed, there was no point in enlightening his cousin. Elizabeth's mother and younger sisters were not only noisy, but obnoxiously ill-mannered. At Bingley's ball, Mrs. Bennet had fairly crowed with glee, boasting to the crowded supper-room of her eldest daughter's triumph in ensnaring Charles Bingley. A bit too cocksure, Mrs. Bennet. Darcy had rescued his friend from this matrimonial trap. He must now trust time and distance to heal Bingley's bruised heart. And yet how could he have foreseen that he himself would encounter Mrs. Bennet's second daughter, here in Hunsford? Elizabeth was just as beautiful as Jane, and far more charming. Moreover, she was enchantingly fond of verbal sparring, and it was Darcy who was her chosen foil. He found such conversation intoxicating. "Miss Bennet," added Fitz, "is everything that is lovely." Perhaps a bit too lovely. Darcy reached for his wine-glass. Like Fitz, he had hoped to see more of her. However, Lady Catherine's reticence could be a blessing in disguise. It was painfully clear that his fascination for Elizabeth had not abated. "Must be provoking for Aunt Catherine, for Anne does not show well in her presence." Fitz checked the time and pushed Darcy's watch back across the table. "If you would get on with it and propose to Anne, old fellow," he teased, "Miss Bennet might be invited again next year." Darcy gave his cousin a look. Fitz would speak of such things, and in Aunt Catherine's own home too. Decidedly, he had had too much wine. Darcy said mildly, "It'll be a cold day in, Hades before I do." Fitz grinned. "Don't prettify your speech on my account." "Propose to Anne yourself." "I thank you, but no. Even if I did wish to marry her, which I do not, I'd be a madman to take on a mamma-in-law who will share my house. There would be no escape, not with London so near. Can you imagine Lady Catherine on the town, with all our friends knowing that we are related?" Darcy could imagine this all too well. "As the years pass," Fitz went on, "she becomes more outspoken and eccentric. This year is no better. She seems continually on edge. I think she's becoming senile." Senile was not how Darcy would describe his aunt's fondness for ordering people about. But Fitz was right. Lady Catherine was behaving oddly. "This new obsession with sketching is puzzling," he said. "I wonder what is in her mind." Fitz lowered his glass. "Sketching? Never tell me our aunt has ambitions to become an artist." "How else can we explain it? I've seen her in the gardens with a sketchbook, and once I even found her in the stables. She told me that she has taken up drawing and likes horses." "Likes horses? Since when? Not very plausible, is it? For of all creatures the horse must be the most difficult to draw. What I was able to see looked like a diagram of the stables. Another renovation project! I thought that cursed chimney-piece would be the end of it. £800, and for what? The blasted chimney still belches smoke when the wind is in the wrong quarter. She has also been evasive about the post, said Darcy. She fairly pounces when it comes in. I've also noticed several letters delivered by express. Now that I can explain, cried Fitz. She has an admirer, who is no doubt a fortune hunter, and she does not wish us to know. You cannot be serious. This is Aunt Catherine we're talking about. Fitz spread his hands. What other explanation is there? What other explanation indeed? I did chance to see a letter to the Archbishop of Canterbury's office. Colonel Fitzwilliam gave a shout of laughter. That explains all. Dear Auntie has requested a special licence in order to marry her swain. He paused. Or should I say, swine? Darcy was betrayed into a smile. Whoever he is, she'll soon make a cat's paw of him. If he exists, said Fitz, which in all seriousness I doubt. She'll have a hard enough time finding a husband for Anne, let alone for herself. Anne's fortune is incentive enough. I do pity her, especially because... The dining-room door came open. Darcy stopped speaking. A footman entered, and he came straight to Darcy. Her ladyship's compliments, sir, and she is wishful to know if you will be joining her in the drawing-room presently. Colonel Fitzwilliam emptied his wine-glass and set it on the table with a snap. Presently, is it? We've received our marching orders. Darcy glanced at his cousin's grinning face. A cup of strong coffee would serve him well. He turned to the footman. Thank you. We shall be in directly. This evening promised to be as dull as all the others. Darcy did not see Elizabeth Bennet until Sunday at church, where he had the doubtful felicity of hearing his aunt's off-hand invitation to Mr. and Mrs. Collins. Could Lady Catherine do no better than to ask them to after-dinner tea? A paltry thing. It would serve her right if Collins declined. But of course the man did nothing of the sort. Thus Darcy was again confronted with Elizabeth's enchanting company, this time in his aunt's drawing-room. Her presence made a world of difference. Even surrounded by the most wearisome people in Christendom, Elizabeth's congeniality shone. The others had little conversation, save for Mr. Collins, who, like a yapping lapdog, echoed everything Lady Catherine said. But Elizabeth answered Lady Catherine's inquiries with gentle assurance. Darcy's heart warmed to see it. There are few people, his aunt was now saying, who have more insight than I when it comes to household economy. Take the matter of carpet runners. They are expensive to replace, and what is worse, they become worn only in the middle. The sides are perfectly fine. And yet, Miss Elizabeth Bennet, with a little deliberate forethought, this problem is easily solved. Is it, ma'am? Said Elizabeth politely. Lady Catherine set her teacup aside. If every member of your family would simply walk with the feet spread just a little farther apart, the carpet would wear evenly. It would last for many more years. Did his aunt honestly suggest this? Elizabeth's face reflected her inner struggle. Darcy understood it. One should never laugh at Lady Catherine. Do you mean waddle? Cried Colonel Fitzwilliam. You cannot be serious. But I am. I have instructed every member of my staff to walk in just this way. With the hind end swaying to and fro? Fitz got up and demonstrated. That's rather indecent, he added, grinning. Elizabeth dissolved into laughter. They all did, except for Lady Catherine and Mr. Collins. It is a very good idea, she insisted. I quite agree, your ladyship, said Mr. Collins. Good for whom? Quipped Fitz. Inmates of Bedlam? More laughter. I can see it now, in all our embassies. Zaza, zaza, in the name of carpet conservation. Drink your tea, Hudson, and be quiet. Her use of Colonel Fitzwilliam's given name brought a scowl and put an end to his jests, which was exactly what Lady Catherine had intended. Nevertheless, Fitz and Elizabeth were soon conversing with the ease of old friends. Darcy listened intently, while struggling to find something intelligent to say. Speaking with a beautiful woman, he now realised, was not easy. Never before had he needed to make an effort. Women were always eager to converse with him. This was no doubt due to the drawing power of his fortune. At length, Darcy decided that it was safer to listen. Observation was more in his line, and there was much to be learned about a person through mindful observation. Here was the crux of the matter. He had not been in Elizabeth's company long enough to detect her faults. Once he discovered these, her bewitching spell of attraction would be broken. Some days later, Darcy put his plan into action and began calling at the Hunsford parsonage. Sometimes Fitz accompanied him, at other times he went alone. Because his objective was to critique, not beguile, he made no extraordinary effort to converse. By chance, he discovered that Elizabeth enjoyed walking each morning in the park, as was her habit at home. Darcy began to do likewise. Sometimes he encountered her while on foot, sometimes he rode on horseback. At these times he allowed himself the pleasure of dismounting to walk alongside her. Not that they conversed. She was often silent. He tossed out whatever topic occurred to him, something about the weather, or the way the trees were clad in the new green of spring, or the expectation of the roses being in bud. Brilliant conversational gambit. And yet nothing off-putting in Elizabeth's character came to light. It became a genuine pleasure to share a companionable silence. Unlike Bingley's ambitious sister, Elizabeth Bennet did not feel the need to fill every moment with talk. Darcy also observed her in company, and his admiration grew. Even Collins's bumbling witticisms did not provoke her. Darcy had expected Elizabeth to exchange knowing glances with Collins's wife, silently mocking him. This she did not do, nor did she attempt to be coy with waspish sarcasm. She was patient with Maria Lucas, who was young and painfully shy, and she was kind to sickly Anne. Lady Catherine could be remarkably ill-mannered. Several times Darcy had been put to the blush by her questions, but Elizabeth either kept silent or replied with tact and grace. She was not cowed by Lady Catherine, nor did she seek her approval. A rarity indeed. This was the sort of woman who would be the perfect mistress of Pemberley. The shock of this thought struck Darcy like a thunderbolt. Could he be in love with her? Nonsense! The idea was as ridiculous as it was impossible, ludicrous even. And yet, hating himself, Darcy stole another look at her. She was smiling, not at him, but at something Fitz had said. She was lovely, absolutely lovely. He drew a long breath as he came to terms with this staggering thought. Had he fallen in love? Preposterous! He was not in love. Was he? And with whom? That was the richest part. A country gentleman's daughter. A young woman with nothing of substance to recommend her. Her fortune was non-existent, her family connections contemptible. How could he possibly be in love with her? And was this not a wonder? He had never thought to be in love with anyone. The next day Fitz took him to task. "You shouldn't gaze at Miss Bennet in that soulful way," he said. "Gad, man, what is wrong with you?" He had lost his heart. That was what. How did one recover from such a blow? Did Elizabeth return his regard? At times Darcy had seen a sparkle of warmth in her intelligent eyes. If she knew what was in his heart, surely her admiration would grow. After all, he was Darcy of Pemberley. This statement was the height of conceit, but it was also the absolute truth. For too long Darcy had been touted as the prize of the marriage mart to think otherwise. Would she appreciate the enormity of his attraction? that he wished to marry her in spite of her family connections and lack of fortune, that he loved her simply for herself. He knew he must speak soon, for his time at Rosings was drawing to a close. He must watch for an opportunity. During one of their morning strolls? Surely not. One did not come alongside a woman in the grove and pounce with a proposal. Not during one of her visits to Rosings Park, for there would be no chance to speak to her alone. A call at the parsonage would be no better. Perhaps he should instead write a letter. He wrote rather well. But this idea he rejected at once. A letter would be seen as the height of cowardice. Here was the truth, in all its unvarnished glory. He was a coward. Then came a day when Mr. and Mrs. Collins came to Rosings for tea, but Elizabeth was not with them. She had remained behind at the parsonage with a headache. Darcy's head came up. This was hardly the best of circumstances, but what choice did he have? He must seize the chance. At once he excused himself and left the drawing-room. Elizabeth's surprise at seeing him was unfeigned, and no wonder. No gentleman of proper feeling would call just now. But the urgency of Darcy's business pushed him on. If not today, there would be no opportunity to speak. And yet he said nothing. She sat in a chair, gazing at him with polite interest, no doubt wishing him elsewhere. Darcy heaved out of the chair and began to pace the room. This was it, now or never. He halted and turned to face her. In vain have I struggled. It will not do. My feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you. Chapter 4. Mr. Darcy continued to talk. Words tumbled out, more than Elizabeth had heard him speak at any one time. She listened in growing astonishment. He loved her? Why? She had never given him the least encouragement. No, it was impossible. Mr. Darcy must be mistaken. She had piqued his interest, perhaps, but he could not love her, not truly. And yet he described how he'd fought against this love for months. Incredible. And there was more. He must detail the obstacles he'd had to overcome, including the inferiority of her family, whose condition in life was so decidedly beneath his own. Any compassion Elizabeth might have felt melted into anger. Mr. Darcy concluded by describing the strength of his attachment, a love that he had found impossible to conquer. And then he waited, his dark eyes gazing into hers. Clearly he expected a favourable answer. As if she would accept a man who had parted Jane from her beloved Mr. Bingley. As if she would entrust her future to a man who had so cruelly wronged a childhood friend. As Mr. Darcy had wronged her new friend, Mr. Wickham. There Mr. Darcy stood, leaning against the mantelpiece, with his eyes fixed on her face. He spoke of feeling anxious, but it was obvious that he felt nothing of the sort. He assumed she would gladly become his wife. It was all pride, insufferable pride, as if wealth and social position were enough to secure her heart. Mr. Collins had had the same expectation when he proposed. Being married to a braggart and a fool was no better than being married to a cold and heartless man. His arrogance, his conceit, and his selfish disdain for the feelings of others made Mr. Darcy a great deal worse than Mr. Collins. Elizabeth found her voice. In cases such as this, I believe gratitude is the acceptable response, if I could feel gratitude. But I do not. I have never desired your good opinion, and you have certainly bestowed it most unwillingly. Surprise flickered in Mr. Darcy's eyes, and Elizabeth rejoiced to see it. She had dealt his pride a blow. He deserved it. I am sorry to give you pain, she added. It has been most unconsciously done, and I hope it shall be of short duration. It took a full minute for Mr. Darcy to compose himself, and when he spoke it was with dreadful calm. "And this is the reply I am to have the honour of expecting." "Could there be any other? I am left to wonder why, with so evident a design of offending and insulting me, you choose to tell me that you liked me against your will, against your reason, and even against your character." She saw him flinch. How long it had been since he heard the truth about himself. "I have other provocations," she said. "You know I have. Do you think any consideration would tempt me to accept the man who has been the means of ruining, perhaps forever, the happiness of a most beloved sister? I have every reason in the world to think ill of you." There was more in this vein, much more. Mr. Darcy did not deny that he had parted Jane and Mr. Bingley, nor did he refute his contempt for Mr. Wickham. Elizabeth gave full rein to her temper, and told him exactly what she thought of his arrogance and pride. Once Mr. Darcy had taken his leave, with cold politeness, Elizabeth was left to face the misery and mortification that comes from speaking one's mind. She dashed aside angry tears, and at last she dissolved into weeping. That she should receive an offer of marriage from Mr. Darcy! That he should wish to marry her in spite of every objection! That he could be so arrogant as to assume that she would fall into his arms! He knew better now, for she had held nothing back. And yet, here Elizabeth's conscience smote her. The provocation had been great, but this was no excuse for cruelty. "I had not known you a month before I felt that you were the last man in the world whom I could ever be prevailed on to marry." Oh, heavens! She had spoken this spiteful thought aloud. She had wounded him simply because she could. Not that there was much heart in him to wound, but it had been badly done. Her wretched, wretched tongue! What was it about Mr. Darcy that brought out the worst in her? Elizabeth buried her head in her hands and surrendered to a fresh wave of tears. All too soon, the sound of Lady Catherine's carriage announced the return of Mr. and Mrs. Collins. Elizabeth could not face Charlotte, or anyone. She hurried upstairs to the privacy of her bedchamber. Chapter 5. Lady Catherine took her seat at the foot of the dining table as the members of her family filed in. No one said a thing. After signing for the first course to be served, she shook out her napkin. "I must say it is rather a relief to have the evening to ourselves. Mr. Collins was unusually tiresome this afternoon." She paused. "Do you not agree?" No one answered, and this added to Lady Catherine's irritation. She did her best to encourage conversation, and this was the thanks she received. "Do not all speak at once," she added. In silence, the soup was brought in and served. "I was sorry to hear what Mr. Collins told us," Colonel Fitzwilliam said at last, "about Miss Bennet feeling unwell and all." Lady Catherine gave a sharp sigh. Elizabeth Bennet was the last person she wished to converse about. Her gaze moved to Darcy. What business had he to scowl at the soup? It was perfectly good soup. Tomorrow could not come soon enough. Tomorrow. The day for which she had schemed and planned. Darcy would be apprehended as soon as he went out for his morning ride. He would be alone in the stables. At that early hour there was no risk of Colonel Fitzwilliam joining him. Later in the morning, Anne would be sent to the rose garden to look for early buds. Lady Catherine would detain Mrs. Jenkinson while the abduction took place. Abduction! It was horrible to think that it had come to this. If Darcy had only done his duty and proposed, but no. His stubborn refusal was forcing Lady Catherine's hand. Her gaze moved to where Anne sat, listlessly stirring her soup. It pained Lady Catherine to admit that her daughter was also to blame. She did nothing to engage her cousin's affection. One might assume that she was completely indifferent to him. By this time tomorrow, All that would change. Lady Catherine's instructions were explicit. Anne was to be treated gently and given every consideration. Granted, she must be bound and gagged. Such barbaric terminology. But this could not be helped. Anne would return within the week, safely wedded to Darcy. Lady Catherine had seen to the special licence herself. She turned to Darcy. "Is something wrong with the soup? Why do you scowl so?" Colonel Fitzwilliam spoke up. "Black looks become him, ma'am. After all, we leave the day after tomorrow. This has been a pleasant visit." "I beg your pardon." Darcy spoke with stern formality. "A matter of business has presented itself and requires my attention." "Business at the dinner table? Gracious! Has it come to that? You modern gentlemen are too preoccupied with business. In my day it was never so. Unless," Lady Catherine sent a coy smile in Darcy's direction, "the state of my own fortune is at risk." She had said this in jest, but Darcy's frown deepened. "As you recall, ma'am, we were given explicit instructions to refrain from looking into your personal finances." Indeed, yes, for there would be much to discover. "It is a sad day," she replied, "when one's own aunt cannot make a simple observation. Heavens, you are disagreeable tonight." Lady Catherine gave a nod to the footman, and the soup tureen was cleared away. "Colonel Fitzwilliam," she said crisply, "as your cousin is too preoccupied with business, would you kindly carve the joint of beef when it is brought in?" He agreed readily, and again conversation came to a standstill. Lady Catherine sighed. Since no one would talk, she began a silent catalogue of tasks that must be complete by morning. She soon hit a snag. Clothing. Botheration. Darcy's valet watched over his garments like a fiend, and her maid Dawson was just as protective of Anne's clothing. And yet Darcy and Anne must take with them several sets of clothes. This Lady Catherine must see to herself. But when? She suddenly realised that with everyone at dinner, including the staff, the time was now. Abruptly, Lady Catherine pushed back from the table and rose to her feet. Darcy and Fitzwilliam politely followed suit. "If you will excuse me for just a moment." Lady Catherine deliberately kept her tone vague. There were a multitude of reasons why an older woman must step away from the dinner table. With hasty dignity, she climbed the long staircase. In one of the attics waited 2 aged portmanteaux. Lady Catherine had cleaned them herself. For whom could she trust? Into Anne's rooms she slipped. Soon 1 portmanteau was filled to overflowing. Darcy's rooms were also deserted. Lady Catherine could not exactly thank Providence for her good fortune tonight. However, she would certainly send several bottles of wine to the servants' table. If Darcy's man had had a little too much wine, so much the better. As for Dawson, Lady Catherine knew that she indulged in a nightly glass of liquor. It was said to be a tonic for arthritis, but Lady Catherine knew better. Long years of married life acquainted her with what a gentleman would need. Down to the entrance hall she came, lugging the 2 portmanteaux. If her luck held, Darcy's man would not notice the loss until morning. Cloaks and hats were in the butler's cloakroom. But what reason would there be to keep 2 pieces of luggage overnight? By the time she returned to the dining room, a little out of breath, Lady Catherine had her answer. Her butler was attending the table, which suited her purpose perfectly. "Mrs. Collins was telling me the other day of several needy families in the parish," she announced, while Darcy held her chair. "I wonder whether either of you have items of clothing that are ready to be discarded. I have set aside a few garments of my own, but if you have anything to contribute, do add them to the pile in the cloakroom." "My man sees to that himself," said Darcy. Colonel Fitzwilliam gave a shrug. "I brought precious little with me into the country, ma'am, and thus I have nothing to add to your pile. Convey my apologies to Mrs. Collins." Lady Catherine turned to Colonel Fitzwilliam with a smile. "I shall be pleased to do so," she said. "You will not mind if I speak to her privately. I find it distressing to talk of my charitable works outside the family circle. She took up her fork. Do you not agree? No one said anything, which of course meant they did. At the conclusion of dinner, it was Colonel Fitzwilliam, not Darcy, who helped Lady Catherine with her chair. It would be a mercy, Aunt, he said quietly, to give Darcy leave to attend to his correspondence, instead of requiring him to hang about in the drawing-room. Hang about? What sort of talk is this? This is his last evening with us, or almost his last evening, I should say. Of course he wishes to join us in the drawing-room. Lady Catherine heard Colonel Fitzwilliam sigh. Gracious! The manners of this younger generation! It was the duty of her nephews to attend her. A fine example she would be if she allowed them to forget this. Chapter 6. The following morning brought no relief to Elizabeth's troubled mind. If only Mr. Darcy had not spoken. If only he had not been so disastrously precise. He, who prided himself on honesty, had certainly been honest. Yes, and so had she. She had also been petty and mean and spiteful. No matter that she was shocked and astounded to learn of his love for her and of his disdain for her family. Poor manners on his part did not give her leave to respond with malice. There was no other word for it. How ashamed Jane would be to hear of her behaviour. Gentle Jane would have refused Mr. Darcy's offer with graciousness, instead of casting insults. Elizabeth took a turn about the room. Why was she feeling remorseful? Did not arrogant people deserve to hear the truth about themselves? And yet she had used truth to deliberately wound him. Even now she could recall the shock and pain in Mr. Darcy's eyes. He so obviously expected that she would return his regard. Was she feeling pity? Why should she pity Mr. Darcy? Charles Bingley was lost to Jane forever, and this was entirely Mr. Darcy's doing. She would never forgive him for parting them. Not ever. And yet at the same time, Elizabeth knew better. Bitterness was an ugly, sour thing. She would eventually be called on to forgive him. Worse, Mr. Darcy must one day forgive her for her part in yesterday's disaster. Oh, why had he spoken of his love for her? Why had she spoken of her contempt? She must forget his proposal entirely. She must seal off the memory and never think of it again. Unfortunately, all her efforts towards this end were in vain. She could think of nothing else. In time, Mr. Darcy would forget his love for her, but not his resentment or pain that she had deliberately inflicted. Elizabeth continued to pace about as waves of shame warmed her cheeks. She must do more than attempt to forget. She must confess her fault. Oh, but she did not wish to do so. It was mortifying to humble oneself. Elizabeth fought against this idea for some time. Presently, however, she surrendered to the promptings of conscience and went searching for a pencil and paper. She would jot a brief note to ease her guilt. I would like to apologize for the way I spoke to you yesterday. I was not feeling well, and your declaration took me completely by surprise. As you know, because I made it abundantly clear, I have never sought your good opinion, nor have I attempted to beguile you in any way. Doubtless you now see that we would not suit, and that you have escaped a miserable union. Nevertheless, I am ashamed of the spitefulness of my response to you. Several months ago I declined an offer that was presented with equal, if not greater, fervour and condescension. My lack of fortune, the fact that I would never receive another offer, and even the faults of my character were thrown in my face. I suppose you were the unwitting beneficiary of my dislike for this person's presumption. I share this incident by way of explanation, not as an excuse. I behaved badly. Will you forgive my cruel and unkind words? Please accept my best wishes for your future happiness." Elizabeth signed her name and then folded the paper into a small square. What she ought to do was cast it into the fire, as this was a confession to God more than it was to Mr. Darcy. Instead, she slipped the note into a pocket. A few minutes later, fearing that it might fall out and be found by someone, she tucked it into her shoe. Not that she would give this note to Mr. Darcy, but if opportunity presented itself— oh, surely not. She hadn't the courage to face him, even if only to hand him the note. His departure tomorrow would mean a courtesy leave-taking. A small nod and a polite smile were all that propriety demanded. She could certainly manage these. To part from Colonel Fitzwilliam would be more difficult, as he was such a pleasant gentleman. Granted, he was not as handsome or as charming as her new friend Mr. Wickham, but then few men were. Yet she had to admit that even Colonel Fitzwilliam shared some of Mr. Darcy's arrogant pride. Had he not confessed, half in jest, that he was expensive in his habits and must marry an heiress? Money and matrimony. Elizabeth was sick to death of both. She paced about some more, pausing occasionally to gaze out the window. The cheerful beauty of the spring morning was at variance with her low spirits. Presently, she decided that nothing was to be gained by remaining in her room. Although it was early, a walk through the park would clear her mind of these oppressive feelings. Once out of the parsonage, Elizabeth had a change of heart. She had several times encountered Mr. Darcy on her favourite ramble through the grove. Today she would go elsewhere. She therefore crossed the lane and entered the grounds of Rosings Park itself, with the intention of examining the formal rose garden. If she met the gardener, she could claim to be looking for early blooms. It was a good half-mile to the mansion itself, but Elizabeth was in no hurry. She wandered the immaculate gravel paths, grateful to be without Mr. Collins's enthusiastic commentary. How much more did she enjoy the natural beauty of her favourite walk? However, by this time tomorrow, Mr. Darcy would be gone, and she could return to the grove without worry. The ornamental rose garden came into view. Its bushes were covered with new leaves and tight buds. Elizabeth was about to pass by when she noticed a large basket, adorned with a red bow, lying on its side. Spilled onto the ground were a pair of garden shears and a note instructing Anne to cut only the pink buds. Were there pink buds? And why would Anne de Bourgh be set to such a task? Without thinking, Elizabeth righted the basket and placed the shears and note inside. A sound caught her attention, and she straightened. Was someone here? Yes, there must be, for she heard footfalls on the gravel. The gardener, perhaps. But the greeting Elizabeth planned to utter died on her lips. From behind, strong fingers took hold of her shoulders. A large hand was clamped roughly over her mouth. Elizabeth twisted and tried to scream, but the fingers held hard. "This be the one," a man's voice announced. "Dark hair, yellow dress, hat with a ribbon, gloves." Elizabeth twisted round, but was unable to see her attackers. The hands that held her were terribly strong. "All ladies wear gloves," another voice said. "She's got the basket, that's enough for me. She came smash up to it like. A quarter hour early. I don't like it, Manny. That dress ain't yellow, it's more the colour of spoilt milk, and she's supposed to be puny, delicate-like." Elizabeth aimed a kick at the man who held her shoulders. "Ow!" Someone slapped her cheek, hard. Elizabeth gave a cry of pain and fought harder. There was anger in the first man's voice. "Look, she's the only one here. She fits the bill. I say we take her and clear out. We ain't got time to dawdle, not with the gent already aboard." "Gent?" Elizabeth longed to cry. "What gent?" But the men were now marching her away from the rose garden. With horror she realised they were heading for a tall laurel hedge. What would happen to her when they reached a concealed area? Then the noise of horses and wheels met her ears. A team of horses, coming at no slow pace, pulling what sounded like a heavy coach. A cloth now replaced the hand over Elizabeth's mouth, and it was bound tight.
"I'll belt you one if you scream, missy. It's no use. No one will hear."
Incredibly, someone was binding her hands with rope.
"Into the wagon you go."
Wagon? Elizabeth aimed another kick. It must have been successful, for she heard a man's voice curse. Someone gripped her ankles, and they too were bound with rope. Was she being kidnapped? In broad daylight? She could see a high, closed delivery wagon with its rear doors open. Someone, wearing dark clothes, was lying on the floor. Was he dead?
"I hope you've had yourself a good breakfast, missy," a rough voice said. "We got miles to travel before you'll have another." "But you ain't alone," said someone else. "We brought a companion, see? All the proprieties for a lady."
Elizabeth squirmed and twisted, but the hands that lifted her into the wagon were none too gentle. She joined the body on the floor of the wagon, and the doors were pushed shut. Next she heard the metallic click of a bolt being pulled to. There she lay, on rough wooden boards that were none too clean. Behind her someone groaned. Whoever this was, he was still alive. If she could work her hands loose, perhaps they both might find a way to escape.
"We change horses at Bromley," she heard someone say.
There came the crack of a whip, and the wagon lurched into motion. Out of the garden it rumbled, and with each bump, Elizabeth's head knocked painfully against the floor. Mr. Darcy and the note she had written were all forgotten. Elizabeth now begged God for deliverance. Presently she felt the wagon take a sharp turn. Had they reached the gates of the Rosings estate? Was Mr. Collins at the parsonage, and did he come rushing to the windows to see— what? A delivery wagon was of no consequence. Surely he would call to Maria and Charlotte, and they would exchange a knowing smile. Mr. Collins was so silly over who came and went at Rosings. But not today. Her foolish cousin could well be the only means of escape. Elizabeth longed to cry out for help, but she could make no sound. There was a faint taste of blood in her mouth. What would her friends do when they discovered that she was missing? What would these men do when they learned that her family could pay no ransom? And who was the man lying beside her on the floor? Chapter 7. Hours passed. By this time Elizabeth was thoroughly cold. The hardness of the wagon's floor and the continual rattling awakened pain she never knew she could feel. She had given up trying to free her hands. The ropes were too tight and cut into her skin. Her feet were numb. When she attempted to free them, she ended up kicking the man who lay beside her. She heard him groan. If only she could discover his identity. But her shoulders and hips would not cooperate. She could not manage to turn herself. The wagon rattled on, dark and fearfully noisy, like a night terror. As the horses were being changed, Elizabeth felt a stab of hope. Surely there were people at the coaching inn in Bromley. Could she manage to alert them? Would a miracle enable her to escape? But the doors remained firmly bolted. Soon enough the wagon was again on its way to— where? Even if she could see properly, how could she begin to guess their direction? Would it matter if she did? After a time the wagon pulled to the side of the road. The bolt was drawn back, and the doors came open. The daylight hurt her eyes.
"Are ye daft?" she heard a woman's voice complain. "Where's her blindfold? Gad, if something wants doing, it's me as has to do it."
Had this woman been with them all along? No, she had likely joined them at Bromley. This kidnapping was no random event. It had been carefully planned. Elizabeth gave a heavy sigh. She was found wandering the grounds at Rosings Park, wearing beautiful clothes that gave the lie to the true state of her family's financial situation. In short, thanks to her mother's love of fashion, she appeared to be an heiress. But there would be no money to pay ransom. What would happen to her when this was discovered? The wagon swayed a little as the woman climbed inside. Elizabeth struggled to raise her head, but the woman's hand pressed her temple against the floor.
"Don't fight, dearie. You'll not be getting a look at any of us." There was a pause. "If a task calls for brains, it's hopeless to send a man."
Whereupon a blindfold was fastened securely over Elizabeth's eyes. The woman then seized her shoulders.
"Now then, up you come. We'll be marching out to the woods to use the privy, so to speak."
Elizabeth thought that she had experienced every sensation of mortification. She now discovered that she was wrong. At least it would be a woman who accompanied her.
"What about the gent?" a man's voice growled. "He's out cold."
"All the easier to blindfold," said the woman.
"Why you never done it before is beyond me. Do you want him testifying against you?"
The man gave a grunt.
"Haven't got a blindfold." "Must I think of everything? Use your neckerchief for pity's sake."
The woman then pulled Elizabeth from the wagon.
"I'll free your feet. Don't try anything, or you'll be sorry."
It took some minutes for the numbness to abate. Even so, it felt good to stand, even if it was only to be marched into the woods. When she and the woman returned, the rag binding Elizabeth's mouth was removed.
"Don't bother screaming, there's no one to hear."
Elizabeth felt a cup pressed against her lips.
"Drink up, dearie, if you know what's good for you."
Elizabeth jerked her face away. The water had a foul taste.
"It's water, not gin. We can't have you perishing from thirst."
Elizabeth resigned herself and emptied the cup.
"Now for the real stuff," said the woman.
There was a pause, and Elizabeth again felt the rim of the cup against her lips. This was not water. The strong tang of cinnamon-flavoured spirits caused Elizabeth to recoil. "What is this?" she sputtered.
"A bit of something to send you to sleep, missy."
The man's voice was now speaking.
"Just following orders, making you comfortable like."
"Orders?" demanded Elizabeth. "Whose orders?" The woman laughed.
"As if you do not know. Go on, Manny," she added. "What need had you to slap her?" "I didn't. Not bad, anyway." "Are you daft? The print of your hand's on her cheek, plain as day. No harm's to come to the pair of 'em. That's orders. There's a bounty to be had, so you best keep that nasty temper to yourself."
A hand tilted Elizabeth's chin.
"You'd better swallow it down,"
the man growled. When she resisted, the woman's fingers grasped the back of Elizabeth's neck, pulling her hair. Elizabeth gave a yelp of pain.
"Lend a hand, Manny. We've got to get this down her, and then him, such as he is. I see you left your calling card on his face." "That's his lookout, not mine. He wouldn't come easy and got what was coming."
Elizabeth felt a stab of pity for the man, whoever he was. She had no choice but to swallow the bitter-tasting drink. Her feet were bound again, and the gag was refastened over her mouth. Without ceremony, she was returned to the hard floor of the wagon. From the sounds of it, her kidnappers were now administering the drink to the man. She heard him sputter as he was forced to swallow. The taste of cinnamon meant something. But what? Why was it so difficult to think clearly? An odd feeling of well-being swept over Elizabeth like a wave, along with a lessening of pain. This meant something too, but Elizabeth was too weary to reason it out. Her fellow prisoner was lowered ungently. She heard his head strike against the floor when he was dropped. Then the doors slammed shut and were bolted. Elizabeth listened carefully. Yes, her companion was breathing. With shouts and more cracking of the whip, the wagon jolted into motion. This time Elizabeth did not fight against its rumbling and rocking. Just as she was surrendering to sleep, the word laudanum drifted through her mind. That was it, wasn't it? The cinnamon taste told the tale. She and her fellow prisoner had been dosed with laudanum. The wagon's wheels hit another rut in the road. This one was deep, and the wagon swayed dangerously.
"What in blue blazes?" shouted a woman's voice. "This ain't no time to be drinking, you git." "A fellow needs something to warm him," a man's voice shouted back. "That wind cuts like a knife. If we break an axle out here, we're done for. Hobgoblins and ghostly horsemen of the moor? Bah, bogies to scare children." "Not goblins, you dolt. Marshes and bogs have what they calls quicksand, that what swallows man and beast alive. So keep your wits about you. It's Dartmoor prison I'm not liking. Too close for comfort, that is."
Darcy frowned in an effort to think. The vile potion his captors had him swilling made his head swim. Dartmoor prison. Did this mean they were in Devon? The wagon gave another jolt and listed to one side.
"God blast it, Manny! Slow down! We'll be ditched if you keep to this pace."
The wagon righted itself and went lumbering on. Darcy heard his fellow prisoner groan. Here was another perplexity. That he was kidnapped for ransom was understandable. But why involve a woman? Unless it was his cousin Anne. Of course it was Anne. Who else could it be? Even without this ordeal, his cousin's life was not a happy one. And now she was being held for ransom. With a miserable howl, the wind buffeted the wagon's high sides.
"Blast this infernal wind!" the man shouted. "What was Jackman thinking? Why this godforsaken place? For easy money, that's what. Nab the gent and the girl, dump them here and clear out. Why not hide 'em in London, instead of driving 200 miles and more in all this cold? What I wouldn't give for a warm fire and a pint. We'll have both soon enough once we get free of the moor, if you don't ditch the wagon."
The wind howled, and his captors continued to complain. At length, Darcy grew weary of listening to them. If only his headache would abate, perhaps then he could think. Some time later he woke to more cursing.
"How do you know it's the right house?" "Only one out here, dolt. Can't miss it," Jackman said. "There's the lake, and there's the house."
At last the wagon ground to a halt. Darcy came fully awake, every sense on the alert. God only knew what would come next.
"Took you long enough," a voice shouted. "This ain't exactly the easiest spot to find. Lend a hand, I want to be away before nightfall. No need to be telling me twice."
When the wagon's doors came open, Darcy felt the bite of the cold wind. The scent of rain was in the air. Anne was taken from the wagon first, and she moaned several times. This was difficult to hear, but it meant she was alive. Presently the men returned for Darcy. He was pulled into a sitting position, and the rope binding his ankles was removed. When his feet met the ground, Darcy realised that he wore only stockings. What had happened to his riding boots?
"March," someone ordered.
Darcy did so, stumbling over wet, rocky terrain, and then it began to rain. A chorus of curses erupted. Rough hands pushed Darcy along. Then a surprise. His feet encountered wooden boards. The hollow sound reminded Darcy of a dock, and his guess turned out to be correct. Amid complaints about his size and weight, he was lowered into a small boat. The rain gained in strength. Darcy could hear it hissing against the surface of the water. Oars were fitted, the boat swayed precariously. Finally it was pushed clear of the dock. Darcy struggled to think. Were he and Anne being taken out of England? But that could not be right. To board a sea-going vessel, shouldn't they be in a port city? Hold hard. Someone had mentioned a lake. Was this significant? He wished he knew. If only his head did not throb so. It took some time to reach their destination, which turned out to be another dock. Darcy was hauled out and made to walk a short distance to a building. Once inside he encountered warmth, with the snap and crackle of a fireside and a mouth-watering aroma of soup or stew. Someone pushed him into a chair and cinched a rope around his calves. And now the race was on, for his captors were keen to depart. There was much stomping about, and over this he heard the woman's rough voice as she took inventory of supplies. Apparently he would be a prisoner here for some time. Of Anne there was no sign. The door slammed several times, and at last the room grew quiet. Were his captors leaving? Presently Darcy sensed someone leaning over his chair.
"Here you are, Governor. A paring knife with which to cut yourself free, see? But you can't see now, can you?"
There came a clattering sound.
"Mercy me! I dropped it on the hearth."
Darcy heard the door come open.
"Bert!" someone hissed. "The boat's loaded! Come on!"
The man was still leaning over him, and Darcy readied himself for a blow. With fellows like this, one never knew. Then came the sound of shuffling feet and the opening of a door.
"'Tis a game of hide and seek for you, governor. Best o' luck. You'll be needing it."
The man gave a sharp laugh and went out. The door was shut securely. Darcy waited, scarcely daring to breathe as the man's footfalls died away. A log on the fire fell apart with a sharp hiss. Was he alone? No, surely there was a guard posted. The wind gave a moan and hurled rain against the window panes. Only an idiot would remain out in this weather. So where was the guard? Why had the man left him with a knife? And then there was the tantalizing aroma of soup. Somehow he must cut himself free and see to Anne, if Anne were here. And then, by heaven, he would eat. But his calves were not tightly bound, and he was soon able to wriggle free. From there it was a painful, but not disastrous, drop to the floor. It took some time to locate the knife, and even longer to cut himself free, but he managed it. Off came the blindfold and the hateful gag. He was desperate for a drink of water, and he knew where to find it, the lake. Out the door he stumbled, heedless of his stocking-clad feet. Despite his desperate thirst, Darcy was pulled up short. There, before him, lay an expanse of desolate, wind-swept moor. Was there a more isolated, lonely spot in all of England? The boat was on the far side of the lake. Escape would not be easy. His captors were not joking about the approach of nightfall. Darcy stumbled to the lake's edge and scooped icy water into his cupped hands. Ah, the heaven-sent wonder of clean, clear water. Never was he more grateful for something so simple and life-giving. He knelt there, heedless of the rain, breathing out a prayer of thanks. He might not be in fighting form, but God be praised he was alive and whole. He must next see to Anne, if she were here, for surely she was as famished and as thirsty as he. The house was built of quarried stone and was not large. The ground level consisted of a small vestibule and 2 rooms. The front room, which was meant to be the dining room, held a jumble of supplies. The staircase was blocked with a mountain of firewood. An oddity. Beyond was a rough wall built with fresh lumber. Apparently his captors did not want him accessing the top floor. The kitchen was detached from the house. Where were the stables and outbuildings? On the other side of the lake, perhaps? But he should not stand here gaping. He must help Anne. The second room faced the back of the house. It was probably meant to be a sitting room, but it too had been adapted for his captor's purpose. In the corner stood a large bed, piled high with blankets. Only one bed. Why had that been brought down? A little fearfully, Darcy came up to it. Against the pillows was Anne's bonnet-clad head. She was well covered up and sleeping. He gave a sigh of relief. Anne was alive. Should he wake her? Surely she was in need of water. Her clothes were likely as filthy as his, but Darcy was not about to help Anne change into something clean. If there were clean clothes here, he could, however, cut the ropes that bound her. Darcy twitched back the coverlet to reveal Anne's feet and discovered a pleasant surprise. The ropes that bound her ankles had already been cut. Carefully he removed her shoes. From one fell a folded paper. Why would Anne have such a thing in her shoe? Was this a clue? Darcy pocketed it. Her breathing was regular, but Darcy knew that she would sleep more comfortably if he removed her bonnet. It was a sad thing, crushed beyond recognition, but it had protected her head. Carefully, Darcy untied the ribbons and drew it off. Anne gave a great sigh. Darcy did likewise, and he felt his knees grow weak. For it was not his cousin Anne who lay sleeping in the bed, but Elizabeth Bennet. Elizabeth. The only woman he had ever loved. Elizabeth, who loathed him as thoroughly as a woman could loathe a man. And they were here together, imprisoned in this lonely house on the moor. Chapter 8. Lady Catherine's grand scheme was unravelling at an alarming rate. Oh, Anne had been sent to procure roses at the proper time, but she returned to the house almost at once. The basket had fallen into the dirt, and Anne was unwilling to touch it. The shears were missing, and besides, there were no pink rosebuds that she could see. Lady Catherine herself had marched Anne back to the garden and made her wait on a bench in the sunshine, a healthful practice. There Anne sat, hunched and brooding, swinging a foot to and fro in a most unladylike way. After half an hour, when the abductors did not appear, Lady Catherine had no choice but to take Anne back into the house. This was what came of hiring ruffians to do a job of work. Incompetence and sloth. Apparently the abduction was off. Lady Catherine was beyond angry, and what was worse, there was no one at whom she could rant. How did one bring criminals to book? For the rest of the day she fumed and stormed about, until even loyal Dawson went into hiding. And then Darcy did not come down for dinner. At first, Colonel Fitzwilliam was annoyed, but as the night wore on, he grew worried. When Darcy did not appear for breakfast the next morning, he saddled a horse and launched a search of the estate. Darcy was nowhere to be found. Thus, Lady Catherine was left to confront an awful truth. Darcy had been taken, and yet Anne was left behind. And then Mr. Collins came to call, blubbering nonsense about Miss Elizabeth Bennet. She too had disappeared on Friday, and her bed had not been slept in since. He hated to intrude, but had Miss Bennet come to call yesterday and forgot the time? Idiot! She soon sent him scuttling back to the parsonage. But it was now Saturday night. Mr. Collins was back, this time accompanied by his distraught wife. "Are you certain that you have not seen her?" Mrs. Collins was now saying. "She left the parsonage Friday morning to walk the grounds of the Rosings estate." "Am I anyone's keeper? There is no need to indulge in dramatics, Mrs. Collins. Miss Elizabeth Bennet has simply run off, as girls of her class are wont to do. Her mother ought to have supervised her upbringing more closely. 5 daughters, she added scornfully, and all of them out. Most irresponsible." "I suppose you mean it is I who ought to have supervised Elizabeth more closely," said Mrs. Collins. "Nevertheless, it was your nephew—" Lady Catherine interrupted. "I do not care for your tone, Mrs. Collins. What has Darcy to do with any of this?" "On the evening before Elizabeth disappeared, I am told that Mr. Darcy came to call. He spoke with her alone. Might I speak with him, please?" "He, is not with us at present. He had urgent business." Colonel Fitzwilliam cleared his throat. "Did he indeed, ma'am? This is the first I've heard of it." Lady Catherine rounded on him. Must she explain it again? "He told us at dinner on Friday, you will recall, that he had a pressing matter that demanded attention. Obviously he has taken himself off to London." "Leaving his coach behind? I think not, ma'am." "Colonel Fitzwilliam, are you saying that Mr. Darcy has not been seen since Friday?" "It does appear that way, yes." Lady Catherine did not care for the direction this conversation was taking. "Miss Elizabeth Bennet is remarkably headstrong," she announced. "She simply will not listen. I have remonstrated with her several times on the unwisdom of wandering about without a companion. And what has been her response? Nonsensical nattering about how she was accustomed to do so at home and that Rosings was perfectly safe. Which it is. Doubtless she has eloped with the curate. But, ma'am," stammered Mr. Collins, "at present I haven't a curate." "With a soldier, then. Girls are such fools for men in red coats. I thank you, dear aunt, for the vote of confidence. I, the only soldier she knows here, have eloped with no one, nor would I. Lady Catherine glared at Colonel Fitzwilliam. Mrs. Collins would not be silenced. I say again, ma'am, that Mr. Darcy is involved in some way. Once before, in my absence, he called at the parsonage. I found him in the parlour, alone with Elizabeth. Are you implying a romantic liaison? Nonsense! She scarcely spoke to him, nor did he speak to her. It is not nonsense, ma'am, insisted Mrs. Collins. This is now the second day that both she and Mr. Darcy are missing. Therefore, it is time for Mr. Collins to contact Elizabeth's father. He shall have something to say in the matter. Indeed, Lady Catherine, said Mr. Collins, although I am loath to contradict your wishes, for surely you know what is to be done in each and every happenstance, in this case I have an obligation to my cousin. My duty, though unpleasant, is clear. Therefore, Lady Catherine cut him off. Do be quiet, Mr. Collins. We are making every inquiry, until we determine when and how she was taken. Taken, ma'am? Cried Mrs. Collins. Lady Catherine pursed up her lips. Now the fat was in the fire. She did not mean to let that detail slip out. I did not share this before, she said slowly, as I did not wish to alarm you. Not alarm me. Do be quiet and listen, Mrs. Collins. Your impertinence is most unbecoming. I suspect that Miss Elizabeth has been kidnapped. Yes, kidnapped. That delivery wagon, cried Mr. Collins. What delivery wagon? Snapped Lady Catherine. There was no delivery wagon. Colonel Fitzwilliam raised his voice. Pray continue, Mr. Collins. What wagon is that? It was black, pulled by a team of 4 horses. I saw it from my window as it left the estate. Friday morning it was, travelling at a fearful pace. As it rounded the corner into the lane, I was certain that it would overturn. Was it entirely black? Demanded Colonel Fitzwilliam. Or did it have the name of an establishment emblazoned on the side? Mr. Collins was roused to animation. It was altogether black, and it answers perfectly, he crowed. The moon, you see, is new just now. Those who are ardent gardeners, as am I, must attend to the seasons and phases of the moon as described in the almanac. If the wagon was fitted up to travel on a moonless night, Lady Catherine cut him off. Then that explains it. It most certainly does not, said Mrs. Collins. Why would anyone kidnap Elizabeth? Her family is not wealthy. Obviously the kidnappers thought she was Anne, said Lady Catherine. We shall know more once the ransom note arrives. To that end, I suggest that you go home and wait. Wait? For how long, ma'am? Within the week Elizabeth's uncle will send his man to meet them in Bromley. And then what do we say? Mr. Collins, you are to take your wife home, and you are not to contact Mr. Bennet or anyone else regarding this matter. We shall know more in the morning. Once Mr. and Mrs. Collins departed, there was Colonel Fitzwilliam to contend with. There he stood, leaning against the mantelpiece, insolent and frowning. Kidnapped, ma'am. I had to say something. The elopement idea was better. Isn't it obvious? Darcy has eloped with Miss Bennet. Leaving his coach behind? She snapped. Nonsense! Darcy might have gazed at her like a half-wit, but she was not keen to charm him. She was more likely to elope with you than with Darcy. I am not convinced. That letter. What letter? He studied her with unbecoming reluctance. I searched the stable and yard thoroughly, ma'am, and I found Darcy's riding crop, and embedded in the dirt a silver sleeve button, and also a letter he had written to Miss Bennet. Indeed, I demand to see it. From an inner pocket of his frock-coat he drew a crumpled document. Give it me, at once, do you hear? Again she was subjected to his scrutiny. What insolence! Colonel Fitzwilliam unfolded a clasp knife and proceeded to cut one of the pages. The top half of this he held out to her, but the remaining pages he cast into the fire. Lady Catherine was beyond horrified. stupid boy! What have you done? You are destroying important evidence!" She made a lunge for the fireplace, but Colonel Fitzwilliam held her back. "There were portions of that letter that were private," he said grimly, "with information that Darcy would not wish shared with anyone. Not with me, and most certainly not with you." "Hudson, you are incorrigible!" "Do not call me by that name. Fitz will do." "Hudson Richard Julian Fitzwilliam," she spat at him. "You have ruined everything." "The portion you have is enough." Lady Catherine shook herself free and began to read. "Be not alarmed, madam, on receiving this letter by the apprehension of its containing any repetition of those sentiments or renewal of those offers which were last night so disgusting to you." "Offers?" Lady Catherine fairly screamed. "Do you mean to tell me that Darcy offered for Miss Bennet?" "It certainly looks that way, and she refused him. Apparently her refusal was not to his liking." "Are you saying that Darcy kidnapped Miss Bennet in order to elope with her? Darcy?" "No, I am not, for it is entirely out of character. But it certainly looks that way. Desperation will drive a man to actions he would otherwise never consider." Lady Catherine felt for a chair. Her legs could not hold her. If ever she were tempted to succumb to the vapours, it was now. Darcy had offered for Elizabeth Bennet. Never mind that she had refused him. Those oafish ruffians had ruined everything. It would not be Anne whom Darcy would be obliged to marry. It would be Elizabeth Bennet. That secluded house, which by her own instruction had only one bed. Oh, this was dreadful, simply dreadful. That awful girl had been cast into Darcy's all-too-willing arms. Would he seduce her? Would she succumb? Lady Catherine knew better than to ask. Chapter 9. Someone was saying her name. Not Missy or Dearie, but Elizabeth. She gave a start and discovered that the rim of a cup was at her lips. Not again. She pulled back with a shudder. The cup was once more presented. "Take a sip, Miss Elizabeth. It will do you good." This was a new voice, one that was gentle and did not scold. No rough fingers seized her shoulders, no strong hands shook her. Elizabeth blinked her eyes open. The sudden blaze of light hurt. Was this the sun? No. It was candlelight. She struggled to see a face, but whoever had spoken was concealed in darkness. Darkness was now especially terrifying to her. "Please," she rasped, "no more laudanum. This is only water. Have a little swallow." Elizabeth took a tentative sip. The water was clean and refreshingly cold. She then discovered that her wrists were no longer bound. She could move. With eager fingers, Elizabeth took hold of the cup, a real glass tumbler, and finished every drop of the water. "Would you care for soup?" the kind voice inquired. "I have some here for you." "Oh, yes, please." There was a rustling movement, and then came a heavenly scent. "It smells wonderful." "It is rather good, surprisingly. Try not to look directly into the candle's flame, Miss Elizabeth. After being blindfolded for so long, you'll hurt your eyes. Are you able to sit up?" "Yes, I think so." "You might find it easier to hold the cup if you removed your gloves." Elizabeth looked down. "Yes, of course, Would you like me to help you?" She nodded. In the halo of candlelight, a man's hands appeared. They were clean hands, with nicely pared nails. The hands of a gentleman. "Gracious," she observed. "My poor gloves are quite filthy." "I am glad to see it. Those gloves protected your hands from injury." She extended her arms. "But not my poor wrists, alas." She heard a deep sigh. "I'll bring water so that you can wash. Drink your soup, just the broth to begin with. Your stomach might not tolerate more." That wretched laudanum. Was that what it was? I wondered. All things considered, I suppose it was a mercy. Elizabeth swallowed some of the soup. It was lovely. The perfect temperature for drinking. Had the man seen to that? Thank you for rescuing me. You have nothing to thank me for. We are not yet out of the woods, so to speak. But for the moment, take heart. You are safe. His face was turned away. Who are you? She said. There was a pause. Drink your soup, Miss Elizabeth. She took another swallow of soup and considered this. If you will not tell me your name, why, I should be forced to call you Galahad. He gave a sharp laugh. A misnomer if there ever was one. I am far from being that, believe me. Finish your soup. I'll fetch water and towels. You must tell me your name, you know. Some subjects are best broached in the light of day. What did he mean by that? When he returned, it was only to place before her a bowl of warm water, an expensive bar of amber soap, and a towel. He took away her cup to refill it with more soup, or so he said. His long absence gave Elizabeth time to wash not only her hands and wrists, but also her face and neck. This wonderful improvement made her feel much more like herself. Presently she heard a gentle knocking at the door. May I come in? Yes, please, for I would like more soup. From behind, a filled cup, delightfully warm, was put into her hands. As before, he kept his face turned aside out of the light. You are the man from the wagon, I think. You were tied up and unconscious for much of the time. I was. I heard one of the men say, Manny, I think he was called, that you have a punishing right hook, whatever that means. When he replied, there was a smile in his voice. It means that I hit him with my right fist, Miss Elizabeth. Rather hard. Oh, thank you. Indeed, you are more like Sir Galahad than you think. Not really. You see, I was aiming for his nose, and missed. Elizabeth would have smiled, but it hurt too much. Then she remembered something else. I heard the woman say that he marked your face. I'm sorry for that. It is nothing. I'll recover, and so shall you. By the by, this fell out of your shoe. His hand appeared in the light, holding a folded square of paper. Elizabeth nearly dropped the cup. Her note to Mr. Darcy. Did you read this? She asked, a little fearfully. Not that it was wrong of you to do so under the circumstances. I quite understand. I did not. The smile returned to his voice as he added, Mind, I was tempted. Such a mysterious hiding place. A shoe. I did wonder whether it was a love note. You would have been disappointed. This is a confession of my faults, to God more than anyone else, and also an apology to someone I know. She was about to place the note on the table, but stopped. Not that Mr. Darcy would ever see it, but what about this man? Was there some place she could hide it? Or perhaps she ought to burn it. Yes, that would be best. At the first opportunity she would cast it into the fire. But until then... An idea presented itself, one that was laughably melodramatic. No doubt the laudanum was to blame, but for all that it was a useful thought. Elizabeth tucked the note inside the neckline of her gown. Once her soup was finished, she sat up more fully, pushed back the coverlet, and swung her feet to the floor. Might I have my shoes, please? The hands presented them, and even helped put them on. As he knelt, she was able to see the top of his head. He had thick, dark hair. Are you strong enough to stand? I certainly hope so, for I must make a little call. Mr. Galahad coughed politely. There is, if you prefer, a chamber pot beneath the bed. There is also a privy not far from the house. I would prefer the latter, thank you. Elizabeth stood up and took a step. Her feet were miserably awkward, and she stumbled. He put out a hand to steady her. Allow me to fetch a lantern, for it is windy on the moor, and then I shall lend you my arm. Is that where we are? The moor? Since he went out before answering, Elizabeth was left to ponder this. That sound, for instance. Was it wind? Yes, assuredly. And unless she was mistaken, she could hear rain. When the man returned, she asked about these. You'll need to bundle up, he agreed. but the rain is not pelting down at the moment. There is a nice fire in the front room, so warming yourself after you return will be no trouble. Unless you changed your mind. Elizabeth took his proffered arm. The walk will do me good, I think. Gracious, the floor is solid enough, but it feels like the room is moving. I am experiencing the same. It is because we were in that wagon for 2 days. Elizabeth took one tentative step, and then another. 2 days? Was it as long as that? I fear so. Together they crossed into another room and made for the front door. You'll find the privy in good repair and quite clean, he remarked. You needn't bring a stick. Why would I need a stick? He kept his face averted. Well, when one uses the privy in a country place, a stick is useful. How so? His voice was laced with embarrassment. Or, wait, was he holding back laughter? He was. One ought to knock down any spider's webs that, might be beneath the seat. What? She cried. You have got to be joking. I thought everyone knew that trick. Not quite everyone. Now, thanks to you, I shall continually worry about spiders. Are you always so disastrously informative? Is it a crime, to be honest? Would you rather remain ignorant and be bit? Oh! Before she could stop herself, Elizabeth gave the man's arm a thwack. He laughed, drew back the bolt, and pulled open the door. The wind threw a spray of raindrops in Elizabeth's face. She put up her chin. This should be enlivening. Would you like your bonnet? I thank you, no, for it smells of the wagon. What about your hat? It went missing during the abduction, along with my riding boots. In the darkness, she could barely make out his stocking-clad feet. Then you shouldn't come out. I can manage on my own. I am fast becoming inured to the pain of stubbed toes. It helps if one walks with a marching gait. Shall we brave the gale? As with everything else about this unhappy adventure, it appears I have no choice. The journey to the privy was not arduous, but it was enough to sap Elizabeth's strength, and his. Darcy insisted that she return to bed. I am not such a weakling, she protested. Yes, but I am. Off you go now. She made no further objection, and he heard her open the bedroom door. Have you need of anything else? Nothing that you can provide. A clean nightdress would be lovely. Alas, your poor Mr. Galahad is ill-equipped to be chivalrous. In future, he shall carry a nightdress for a needy lady. He heard a sound. Was it a chuckle? Good night, then, she said. Good night. Their captors had been kind enough to provide a stack of blankets and pillows, so Darcy made a bed for himself before the front door. If intruders came, why, Galahad-like, he would fight them off, or more probably be kicked. Darcy's glow of noble sacrifice lasted for perhaps 5 seconds, after which the hardness of the floor took preeminence. However, he had slept in that wagon, so he could certainly sleep here. He fell asleep to the sound of the relentless wind as it howled across miles of barren moorland. But later it was not the wind that awakened him, but intense sobbing. Fearful panic was in that sound. Darcy was on his feet at once. Propriety or no, something was very wrong. Gingerly he opened the bedroom door. The room was lit only by the fire's embers. Elizabeth was no longer in the bed, but huddled on the sofa in a heap. Her breathing came in gasps. Clearly she was terrified. Darcy came into the room, and from behind the sofa laid a comforting hand on her shoulder. It was only a dream, Elizabeth. Nothing more. No, it wasn't, she cried. It was real. It was a night terror, brought on by the laudanum. The noise, the shaking, the voices, they shouted at me. Demonic voices. Demonic. Darcy came round from the back of the sofa and knelt before her. Surrendering to impulse, he enveloped her in a hug. She needed to be held by human arms just now, even if they were only his. Darcy felt her relax against him, but her breathing was rough and uneven. Bow your head, Elizabeth, he said softly. He felt her forehead press against the lapel of his coat. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Say it with me, Elizabeth. He heard her voice join his. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. Her breathing became more even, and he sensed the tension easing away. Another gust of wind gave a ghostly shriek, but terror was losing its grip on her. When morning came, she would hate him for this. But did it matter? She hated him already. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. She broke off speaking, but he could sense that she was listening intently as he continued to quote the psalm. However, when he said, Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies, Elizabeth began to cry. These were not tears of fright, but of grief. Not that, he heard her whisper. Anything but that. Have you an enemy? He said gently. I have become an enemy to someone, she said brokenly. I did not mean to be so cruel when I refused him, but... Darcy's breath caught in his throat. Was she grief-stricken over him? Would you like to tell me about it? Her words came out in a rush. I wrote an apology, but I was too much of a coward to give it him. He knows I walk in the grove each day, but I deliberately went to the rose garden instead, and this abduction is the result. I'm sure it was a fine apology, said Darcy firmly. When you see him next, perhaps then you can give it to him. I shall never see him again. Not that I would wish to, nor would he wish to see me. There is always the post. It is nicely impersonal, not to mention cowardly. You are no coward, Miss Elizabeth. But I am, and I have a wretched temper too. Without lifting her head from his lapel, she drew the square of paper from the neckline of her gown. If you read this, you'll know. Darcy took it, scarcely daring to breathe. The paper was warm, and no wonder, considering its hiding place. Should he open it now? Would this be fair to her? She had given it to Galahad, not to Darcy. Would his intense curiosity carry the day? Or would honour? Reluctantly, Darcy set the note aside. Perhaps in the morning I shall, with your permission. Would you like to make your bed here, on the sofa, with the fire for company? I'll build it up for you. He felt her head nod in agreement, and he released her. Not until now did Darcy notice that the bed had a luxuriant feather mattress. The blankets and pillows were likewise of excellent quality. Someone had spent money here. But why? From behind the sofa, Darcy covered Elizabeth and eased a pillow beneath her head. He heard her sigh. Then he came round to add wood to the fire. Immediately the flames blazed up with the wood snapping and popping. He knew that his face would be clearly visible. Reluctantly he turned to face her. But Elizabeth said nothing. She had fallen back to sleep. Chapter 10. Darcy awoke to an angry sunrise. A fiery line of red shone from beneath heavy clouds. The wind had dropped, which was a mercy, but he doubted the calm would last. It looked to be another stormy day. There was no sound from the bedchamber, which was probably just as well. To inquire about a trip to the privy would definitely be out of line. As if anything about this situation could be otherwise. Darcy rubbed a hand over his chin. A few more days without a razor and his stubble would become a full-fledged beard. Wouldn't that be delightful? He shrugged into his overcoat and let himself out of the house. This was an excellent time to survey the surrounding countryside. But the longer Darcy walked about, the more sobered he became. This house was indeed on an island. The lake was not natural but man-made. At the far side of the lake was the rowboat, and beyond the dock were outbuildings, stables, a boathouse, and housing for whatever servants could be coaxed to work in this bleak, forsaken place. Even so, the air was fresh and invigorating. Darcy was feeling more like himself, which meant he could get to the bottom of this conundrum. Why had he and Elizabeth been brought here? And how would they escape? As he'd noted before, the kitchen was not attached to the house. It looked to be empty. Even if he forced his way inside, he would find little in the way of help. Back at the house, Darcy launched a thorough search of the front room. In a corner, he found a stack of wooden crates. These held loaves of bread, dried fruit, oats, presumably meant to be cooked, and several crocks of soup, larded beef, and a barrel of salt pork. There were bricks of cheddar cheese and butter, and also a wheel of Stilton. Was theirs to be a lengthy captivity? The sideboard held a collection of china and flatware, including a full tea service. Beneath the dining table, Darcy found wooden buckets for drawing water, and also 2 portmanteaux. One of these was stuffed with his own clothes. The other he did not examine closely, as it held garments for a woman. This he placed in front of the bedchamber door for Elizabeth to discover. He built up the fire, brought in water from the lake, and set a kettle to boil. Presently he heard the bedroom door come open, and then close again. Darcy crossed to the windows and presented his back to the room. A few minutes later the door opened again. "Good morning," said Darcy quietly, without turning round. "I trust you slept well. Did you find the portmanteau?" He heard an exasperated sigh. "I did, thank you, but I cannot wear any of the things in it. They are far too small. Moreover, all but one of the dresses are evening gowns." Was she now smiling? He longed to turn round to see, but this was not the moment for it. "Those are not your clothes?" "Not a one." "Now that is odd. Mine belong to me, meaning that someone on the Rosings estate was in on the plot." "You live at Rosings?" "After a manner of speaking, yes." Darcy kept his gaze fixed on the view of the lake. "As the wind has died down, I was thinking we each could bathe in the lake, at opposite sides of the house, of course. You could wash your dress and hang it to dry." "And what do I wear in the meantime?" Slowly Darcy drew a garment from his portmanteau, and edging backward to the dining table, placed it there. He heard Elizabeth advance into the room. But this is a nightshirt. Your nightshirt." "I have several," he said meekly. "They are all quite clean. You could wear it beneath your cloak while your dress dries. We are equipped with a towel horse." "It appears that I have no choice." There was a pause. "Very well, Mr. Galahad," she said more cheerfully. "The sun is now up. It is high time I learn your identity, especially now that I'm borrowing so personal a garment." "You won't like it. My identity, I mean." "As if there is anything about this situation to like. Why could you not introduce yourself last night, like a sensible man? You'd been through enough of an ordeal without me adding to it." "Good gracious, are you some sort of monster?" "That is for you to decide." Slowly, reluctantly, Darcy turned to face her. This would be painful. She gave a sharp intake of breath. "You!" she cried. "You are Galahad!" "I did not mean to deceive you." "Did not mean to? Oh! This house, this imprisonment, this is your doing. You had me kidnapped. You brought me here." "I beg your pardon," he said blankly. "Is that what you think?" "What else am I to think? You brought me here so that I would be forced to marry you." "Oh, please, as if I wished to figure as the villainous bridegroom." "You arranged this." "Yes, and why not? You have both the resources and the connections to do so." "I have,
he said grimly, "but why would I bring you 200 miles to a love nest on the moor?"
"How should I know?"
"There are easier ways to compromise a woman's reputation, and I'm sure you know them all." "Actually," he said mildly, "I do not. Romance has never been very much in my line."
"It certainly is now. You are detestable."
"Yes, I know, you told me. The last man on earth, etc."
"Nothing shall induce me to marry you, Mr. Darcy. Do you hear? Nothing."
"I don't wish you to marry me. Not if you were unwilling."
"Nor would I want to marry a liar, because that is exactly what you are. You lied to me last night."
"I did not. It is not lying to conceal one's face, nor did I attempt to disguise my voice."
"You convinced me that you are noble and kind and trustworthy."
"You needn't fear. I have no desire to play the role of Petruchio. I wrote you a letter. Not to persuade you in any way, but simply to explain about Wickham and other things. I was on my way to deliver it when I was captured. Hate me if you will, but we do think alike in some ways."
"Meaning that I too wrote a letter. I'm sure you found it vastly entertaining. How you must have laughed."
"Actually, I did not open it. It was hardly fair, as you gave it not to me, but to Galahad."
"I trusted you," she cried. "You lured me into behaving like a fool."
"Nothing about last night was foolish," he said firmly. "We are captives, and as such we are subject to a captive's despair."
"I am the one who is the captive, imprisoned by you."
"Which would explain why you have a pile of clothes that are too small to wear." "Evening gowns, Mr. Darcy. I see you thought to bring the playing cards."
"I brought what?" "An unopened pack of playing cards, right there under the table. Were you expecting me to amuse you with a game?"
The truth hit Darcy like a thunderclap.
"Playing cards!" he shouted. "Plague and the devil take it! I know where we are, and I know by whose design."
Elizabeth recoiled. What do you mean?"
"Why did I not think of it sooner? Confound it, this is Grimstone House." He practically spat.
"What difference does that make?"
"Years ago, my uncle Lewis won it in a card game. That's what. My uncle Lewis de Bourgh."
Elizabeth's mouth fell open. "But the family thought it a very good joke. A hunting lodge on Dartmoor in the middle of a confounded lake. What good is that? He kept it and then willed it to his wife. She has been trying to sell it ever since."
"This house belongs to—"
"To my esteemed aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. She did not mean to kidnap you, Elizabeth. She meant to kidnap Anne. Which explains the wax candles, and the feather mattress, and the Pears soap, and the vast quantity of food. And why you were continually dosed with laudanum, so as to feel very little pain." "That was unsuccessful," she said dryly. "Of course it was. My aunt is not as smart as she thinks. You are not the intended victim. I am. Lady Catherine brought me here so that I would be forced to marry Anne."
"Be forced to? But are you not engaged to her?"
"Who told you so? Wickham?" Darcy pressed a hand to his forehead. "Why would I propose to you if I were already engaged to Anne? No wonder you thought me a knave."
"Lady Catherine could never be so shamelessly bold."
"She has been after me to marry Anne for years. This is entirely her doing. Cast your mind back to the morning you were taken. Was there anything unusual about the rose garden? Anything at all?" "I saw a flat basket with a red bow lying on the ground," said Elizabeth slowly. "And in the dirt a pair of garden shears and a note to cut only the pink buds." She paused. "Upon my word, it was addressed to Anne." "Did you touch the basket?"
"Only to write it. That's when the men seized me. But you cannot mean—"
"That must have been the signal. Take the girl who carries the basket. only it was supposed to be Anne.
Oh, dear.
Lady Catherine's limed all right, caught in her own trap. Can you imagine her dismay when she realised that the wrong girl was taken?
But, oh, this is terrible. How can she be so ruthless?
Comfort yourself with the knowledge that my family is a good deal worse than yours could ever be. I can only hope that no child of mine will inherit Aunt Catherine's Machiavellian tendencies. And you needn't worry about being forced to marry me, he added. As you say, I have both connections and resources. We'll think of something.
Darcy hesitated, fearful to give voice to a truly painful idea.
For instance, what say you to marrying my cousin instead?
Chapter 11.
Underlings, no matter how highly paid, were hopeless without direction. Had that top lofty valet found the packet that Lady Catherine so obligingly pushed beneath Darcy's mattress? With the page's corner temptingly exposed? Of course not. If something needed doing, Lady Catherine must see to it herself. And so, with Colonel Fitzwilliam in tow, she marched up to Darcy's rooms to launch a search. There simply must be a clue, she said over her shoulder. Or a ransom note. One ought to have been delivered by now.
His tone was openly impertinent. Lady Catherine gave an impatient huff. For all his charming insouciance, Colonel Fitzwilliam was surprisingly intractable. Why, he was almost as stubborn as Darcy. At the landing, she paused.
As I told you before, the notion of kidnapping has been manufactured for the benefit of the Collinses. It is meant to set their minds at ease, so to speak.
At ease, ma'am? Lady Catherine ignored his waspish tone.
Most unfortunately, Darcy harboured an even more nefarious design.
Ah, yes, the elopement.
Might I remind you, ma'am, of the report from Bromley? The delivery wagon was said to head due south. Gretna was not its object, nor was London. If you would but give me leave to follow, before the scent grows cold, I could well meet with success.
By this, Colonel Fitzwilliam meant that she should pay for his travelling expenses.
It is the least that Miss Bennet's father will expect of us, he added. Which is why we are searching for additional clues. That valet of Darcy's is useless. Ma'am, Johnson has been frantic with worry. He turned Darcy's rooms inside out. Obviously he missed something. There must be clues. There always are.
Lady Catherine reached Darcy's door, opened it, and went in.
You search over there by the bed. I'll look through the dressing table. Ma'am, Johnson is quite particular about—
Lady Catherine ignored this and began opening drawers. Her nephew stood like stock, frowning.
Go on, she urged. There might be something beside the bed, or even under it.
Soon Johnson heard them and came in. He made a precise bow.
Might I be of assistance, ma'am?
Lady Catherine gave a slight smile.
You have done your very best, I'm sure, but I dare say there is evidence you have missed. We have come to find it.
She darted a quick glance toward the bed. Colonel Fitzwilliam was now on his knees beside it. Any minute now he would see the page, and— She opened another drawer and sorted through the contents. She must not smile or make a sound. It would never do to betray triumph. Presently she heard,
I say, what's all this?
Lady Catherine turned to see her nephew holding the packet.
Found beneath the mattress, of all things. Johnson? Sir, that was not there earlier. I swear it wasn't. We searched everything, Garson and I did. We even turned out the bedding.
Lady Catherine had the grace to keep silent. Colonel Fitzwilliam opened the packet and began rifling through its contents.
But these are the papers for the Grimstone property. What in blue blazes are they doing here?
Gracious me, said Lady Catherine. Imagine that. Is anything missing? He shot her a look.
The key.
Oh, my! I wonder what it means.
Isn't it obvious? Do you mean to tell me that Darcy has gone to Grimstone House? Why would he go there?"
Colonel Fitzwilliam snapped the folder shut. "Perhaps on a repairing lease, ma'am." He flung out of the room. Lady Catherine turned.
"That will be all, Johnson."
She hurried after her nephew.
"Now, Hudson, you are not to do anything rash." "Rash? I'll give you rash."
He was taking the stairs 2 at a time. Good gracious! At this pace she would fall and break her neck. And then where would she be? Yet she could not allow him to leave the house without her.
"For heaven's sake, slow down! We must discuss what is to be done like rational people."
She caught up with him in the entrance hall. As if there was anything rational about this farce, or your involvement in it.
"My involvement?" she faltered. "What can you mean?"
He went into the drawing-room. She hurried after. Deliberately he closed the door.
"I don't know what sort of rig you're running," he spat, "but I intend to find out. I'll follow the trail, even if it means pawning everything I own. How hasty you are, Hudson. Do not call me by that name."
She brushed his objection aside.
"I am coming with you, and so is Anne." "What the devil has Anne to do with any of this?"
To be married to Darcy. But she could hardly say so. In the heat of the moment, perhaps, she had overreached a little. Lady Catherine ran a tongue over her lips.
"As a chaperone for Miss Elizabeth Bennet, of course. However, my presence will answer nicely."
After spending days in Darcy's company, what good will a chaperone do her?
"We must rely on her honour to resist Darcy's advances. I'll send word to have the travelling coach readied at once."
Colonel Fitzwilliam's lip curled. "The de Bourgh coach, ma'am? You'll risk Sunday travel? Or shall we have the crest painted out?"
"Good heavens! As if Sunday travel matters at a time like this. We must rescue poor Miss Bennet, and Darcy as well. He must not be allowed to gratify his baser impulses."
"If it is as you say, ma'am, he'll not thank us for interfering."
"These little affairs are always so unpleasant. What shall become of her, I wonder? Not that it matters. Ah, well, such women eventually find husbands."
Chapter 12. Elizabeth could not believe what she was hearing. Marry Colonel Fitzwilliam, after being told that he must marry an heiress. "I do not wish to marry anyone, thank you." "That is one of the things I like in you."
"As if your opinion matters," she grumbled.
But he was no longer attending. "The wind will be picking up soon, and with it comes the rain. We ought to bathe while we have the chance." She joined him at the window. "In that icy lake, do you mean? Out in the open, where I might be seen by anyone? I'd rather face lions." "I understand, and yet I am not a barbarian, Mr. Darcy. I can heat water and bring it to your room if you prefer. I just thought that after days in that wagon you might like to wash thoroughly." Elizabeth pursed up her lips. He was in the right of it, of course. Oh, to scrub her skin until it was raw. "We've plenty of towels," he went on, "and thanks to Anne, my aunt has provided expensive soap. I'll take the side in front of the house. If our captors return, I'll be the one who is seen and shot." "Kidnappers do not shoot their victims," said Elizabeth crossly. "Not if there's a ransom to be had." "Point taken." With a sigh, Elizabeth examined the nightshirt. Mr. Darcy was right. It was made of fine cotton and beautifully clean. With all the indignities she had suffered, what was one more? And then she remembered that her dress and stays fastened from behind. Heavens! Mr. Darcy began assembling supplies: a large blanket, several towels, the soap, and a bucket for her wet clothes. These he carried out to the lake, which was just as well. Elizabeth had all she could do to manage her own bundle while navigating the stone-littered terrain in bare feet. Together they chose the best spot along the shore, and then he turned to leave. Reluctantly, Elizabeth called him back. "I am in need of a little assistance, sir." Oh, this was mortifying. It would be easier to receive help from anyone else, even odious Mr. Collins. On second thought, no. But speculation was pointless, for what choice did she have? Elizabeth swung the cloak from her shoulders. "It's the buttons on my gown," she explained, "and the tie for my stays." Elizabeth had seen Mr. Darcy angry. She had seen him in emotional distress, and also bored, delighted, offended, and odiously snubbing. But she had never seen him so thoroughly embarrassed. Who would have guessed that his handsome face could turn so red? He stammered. "Very well." He cleared his throat and squared his shoulders. "What must I do?" Why was he not eager and smiling? Shouldn't a man who was deeply in love show a little enthusiasm, instead of all this grudging reluctance? Why, he was feeling just as awkward as she was. Poor, dignified Mr. Darcy! Elizabeth bit back a smile. Suddenly she did not feel quite so shy. Indeed, when she presented her back, a gurgle of laughter threatened to bubble up. How delightful to disconcert him so thoroughly. "You needn't fear," she added. "I wear an underdress beneath the stays. I can manage that myself." She heard him sigh. Was it from relief? Heavens! Couldn't the man show even a little sensibility? Then again, what would it be like if Mr. Wickham were here instead? Elizabeth pursed up her lips. She could well imagine his flirtatious jokes, smilingly laced with double entendre. Mr. Darcy's fine honour was infinitely better. He managed to unfasten the buttons, but the knot gave some trouble. "Forgive me, I am not accustomed to removing a woman's— What I mean is—" His growing impatience made her smile. "It's this knot," he went on. "It's been doubled and is tight. This, garment looks uncomfortable to wear." "One becomes accustomed. Besides, do not some gentlemen wear corsets?" "Yes, and they creak, at all the worst moments." What else could Elizabeth do but laugh? Gracious! Who would have thought that she would laugh with Mr. Darcy? He was right about the change in the weather. They'd only just returned to the house when the storm blew in. Elizabeth was now dressed in the nightshirt, wrapped up in blankets, and seated before a roaring fire. Her bathing ordeal was over. Or almost over. Her poor garments could take hours to dry. She had no access to a flat iron, nor had she the skill to use one. Heaven only knew what her dress would look like. At least her feet and ankles were covered. One did not need stockings to wear kid boots. Mr. Darcy had the benefit of clean clothes, although he was dressed without his usual precision. His shirt was comically wrinkled. Lady Catherine had provided a white cravat, such as a gentleman would wear at dinner. A rust-brown waistcoat, his dark riding-coat, and travel-stained buckskins completed his ensemble. Elizabeth found that she preferred this version of him. He seemed more approachable, less stiff and sombre, and he was inclined to talk. "Ah, for life's simple pleasures," he was now saying. "A warm fireside, a stout roof overhead, and the most delightful of delicacies, toasted bread with cheese." He held out a plate to her. What else could she do but accept? A cup of warm soup followed. Elizabeth sipped meditatively. Who would have thought she'd share a cosy fireside with Mr. Darcy? Since his boots had been stolen, he was in stocking feet. Homely indeed. "Eat your fill. There is plenty," he added. "Unless we are marooned here indefinitely, and then we shall starve." She was rewarded with his sudden smile. "We are castaways, after a manner of speaking, but I doubt we'll go hungry. I found fishing gear in the closet beneath the stairs. Not that my aunt would think to provide rod and line. They must have belonged to Uncle Louis. As if I know how to cook fish, or do anything useful. I am now learning an unhappy truth. My upbringing has been amazingly impractical. Aside from mending the tear in your other shirt after it dries, my accomplishments are of little use here." He quietly placed a chair before the fire and joined her. stretching his stocking feet toward the warmth of the fire. "I embroider badly," Elizabeth went on. "I am hopeless at arranging flowers or adorning bonnets. And as I am never to attend a London opera, I haven't bothered to learn Italian." "You have employed your time more profitably." "I read, but only when the fancy suits me. From time to time I play backgammon or chess with father. I correct my younger sisters endlessly, and then rely on them to share bits of gossip they've picked up. My most noteworthy skill, if one can call it that, lies in critiquing my neighbours, rather harshly at times." Over the top of his cup, his eyes met hers. "We'd best not air old grievances," he said gently. Elizabeth bit back a sigh. "Are you always in the habit of being right, sir?" "No more than you are." What else could Elizabeth do but smile? She hastened to change the subject. "The bread and cheese are delicious, thank you. Would you care for more?" "Yes, please. Although, if I starved myself, I might be able to fit into Anne's clothes." Goodness, was this a joke? Was she joking with Mr. Darcy? Speaking of old grievances, while he was busy at the hearth toasting bread, Elizabeth gathered the blanket, rose to her feet, and made her way into the bedchamber. There, on the floor, was her folded note. She took it up and returned to the front room. When Mr. Darcy returned her filled plate, she held it out to him. "You said something earlier about a letter you'd written. May I have it, please?" He sighed heavily. If only it were that simple. He opened the front of his frock coat to reveal an inner pocket. "The letter was here, and now it is gone. God only knows where it is, or who has read it." A rueful smile twisted his lips. "Like a fool, I signed my name. My full name." "Is that so bad?" He cast himself into the chair. "It could be, depending on who finds it. In that letter I explain, with unfortunate detail, my family's history with Wickham. I also describe his attempt to elope with my sister." Elizabeth could not believe her ears. "Mr. Wickham? Elope?" "I thought you had a right to know the truth, to counter whatever glib falsehoods Wickham has been feeding you." "Forgive me, I cannot comprehend this. He eloped with your sister?" "That was his plan. Thank God she told me of it in time. She was but 15. "How can this be? No, it does not sound like him at all. When did this happen?" "Only last summer. His object was her fortune, which is considerable. £30,000. Elizabeth struggled to digest this. "But the living? He said your father promised him a living which he did not receive." "That much of the story is true. When my father's will was read, Wickham told us he had no interest in becoming a clergyman, for which I thank God. He then negotiated a settlement of £3,000. "3,000? He never mentioned this." "Ah, no. Wickham's memory is, shall we say, adaptable. When the living later became vacant, he approached me again, stating that he had had a change of heart and would be glad to take orders. When I did not respond favourably, he demanded that the living be given him. Of course, I refused." "But this cannot be right." "I understand what you are feeling. As a boy, I trusted Wickham. I believed him to be my friend. I soon learned otherwise. He is as close to an amoral man as I have ever met." "But he has such charm, such ease. He is so pleasant." "Yet he lies with impunity. What is worse, it is impossible to confront him with truth. He believes the lies he tells. He has only the appearance of goodness." "But Jane, you cannot deny your infamy there. You parted Jane from Mr. Bingley." "Because I had no evidence that she loved him. She enjoyed his company and was unfailingly pleasant, but it seemed to me that her heart was not touched." "Oh, this is dreadful! Jane is reserved. She is too good, too kind. She did not display to him all that she felt because she did not wish to oblige him to return her affection." "I see." "I told her how it would be. Yes, and so did Charlotte. She must show more than she feels, not less. And now he is gone. You cannot imagine her heartbreak." There was a pause. "I think perhaps I can." Elizabeth dashed away an angry tear. She must not weep before Mr. Darcy. And yet, poor Jane. "Forgive my jaded viewpoint," said Mr. Darcy quietly. "Of course, you know your mother better than I. Her talk of matchmaking could well be harmless. No more than enthusiasm and high spirits. I am accustomed to encountering raw ambition of the basest sort, particularly in London. Bingley's fortune is a temptation, and so is mine." "Not to me." Again his rueful smile appeared. "A fact of which I am all too aware." "And not to Jane either." "You and Jane are unique in that way." Elizabeth's chin came up. "You think too highly of yourself, sir." "Do I? How long was it after I arrived at that cursed assembly before you learnt the extent of my fortune? As much as 20 minutes? This was unanswerable, for it had been less. "You would not dance with me." "I did not wish to dance with anyone. I only went in order to support Bingley, as if he needed support. Do you think I enjoy being the prize stallion on the bidding block, the object of every matrimonial scheme, simply because of my position and my wealth?" Mr. Darcy was truly angry now. Or could this be frustration? "I also parted Bingley from your sister because of my growing feelings for you. I had never felt that way about a woman before." "You were ashamed of me." "No, I was vulnerable. I was falling in love, and I did not know what to do. Like a coward, I fled. And you can see the good it did me." It was difficult to hear the pain in his voice. "Your sister is a sweet girl, and if she truly loves Bingley as much as you say, and if his interest has not abated, which I dare say it hasn't, I'll not stand in her way." "Hoping to improve your chances with me, perhaps?" Elizabeth clapped a hand over her mouth. "My wretched tongue!" she cried. "I beg your pardon. I had no call to say that. You bring out the worst in me, Mr. Darcy." Now why was he smiling at her like that? "Oh, read your note." "But there is no need, is there?" he said softly. "You needn't fear. It's an apology." "Yes, I know. You've already told me that. And more." Elizabeth caught her breath. What more had she told him? What was it about him that made her feel this way? Vulnerable and exposed and... She hitched the blanket higher on her shoulder and watched him unfold the paper. Chapter 13. Darcy fought to keep his face expressionless as he read, but it was no use. He could feel his features softening. At any moment a foolish smile would find its way to his lips. She had written this note, to him. A wondrous evidence of her generous heart. The sorry fact was, he loved her. In spite of everything that had passed between them, and without hope of any kind, he loved her still. His heart was as much hers as it had ever been, and perhaps more so. Very definitely more so. But Elizabeth's words, though kind, offered not a shred of encouragement. "As you know, because I made it abundantly clear, I have never sought your good opinion, nor have I attempted to beguile you in any way." Darcy was thus put firmly in his place as a rejected suitor. "Doubtless you now see that we would not suit, and that you have escaped a miserable union." No, he did not see this at all. In fact, quite the reverse. But her mind was made up. This note was ample proof. "I thank you for the apology," he said quietly. "I was unbecomingly rude." His eyes met hers. "What did you say of me that I did not deserve?" He had the pleasure of seeing her eyes widen with sincere surprise. That, at least, was something. "My behaviour merited the severest reproof," he continued. "It was unpardonable." "Nothing is unpardonable, sir." "True enough. Although," he raised an eyebrow, "this scheme of my aunt's puts that to the test. As for me, my presumption was both ungentlemanly and arrogant. That you would accept my offer and return my regard I assumed as a matter of course." There was a pause. "I suppose any man who proposes has favourable expectations. Even Mr. Cole—" She stopped. So his guess was correct. The proposal she mentioned in the note had come from Collins. Darcy held it out to her. "You should probably destroy this. In the wrong hands it could cause embarrassment for Mrs. Collins. Wouldn't you prefer to keep it?" Darcy hesitated. He would like it above all things. "I dare not give way to sentimentality," he said gravely. "The risks are too high." She looked openly doubtful. He said, "By tomorrow, or at the outside Tuesday, Lady Catherine will arrive here. Before then we must formulate a plan of action." Elizabeth made a dismissive gesture. "As if there were a course of action open to us. We are captives, you will recall. What else can we do but wait for Lady Catherine to make the next move?" "I beg leave to disagree." "You think she will come herself? The distance is too great. She will send someone." "Not Aunt Catherine. She entrusted our capture to hirelings and was disappointed. She will not make that same mistake twice. Of a certainty she will come." He paused, but Elizabeth said nothing. "Therefore," he went on, "by Tuesday all evidence of my presence here must be eradicated, including this precious note." As if counting his heartbeats, Darcy waited for Elizabeth to take it from him. She merely sat there, gazing into the flames. Before he could weaken and change his mind, Darcy flicked the note into the fire. The paper curled as it burned. And then he heard Elizabeth sigh. Did she care that he burnt her note? He shot a glance in her direction. She gathered the blanket around her shoulders and rose to her feet. Darcy did likewise, but Elizabeth kept her gaze averted. She shuffled into the bedroom and shut the door with a quiet click. He then heard her add wood to the fire. Darcy resumed his seat, perplexed. He had put a foot wrong somewhere. But how? It was in Elizabeth's best interest to destroy that note. Wasn't it? Moreover, she had wanted him to read it, including the statement that their union would be miserable. So why did she sigh? Lady Catherine gave an impatient huff. As if travelling were not irksome enough, she must put up with an overgrown boy who insisted on managing their pace. And yet what choice did she have? There was no one else to whom she could entrust so sensitive an errand. She did not even dare to bring her maid, Dawson. It was necessary to trust her driver and his son, but was this wise? Perhaps it would have been better to hire disinterested strangers, except that even strangers would talk. Whereas John Griffin's father and grandfather had served the de Bourgh family, his silence could be bought. Just now they were halted at a coaching stop. Again. Lady Catherine lowered the window with a bang. "Why is it taking so long?" she called. "This is outrageous!" Colonel Fitzwilliam put down his glass, and with lowered chin came striding across the yard. She did not approve of the look in his eyes, nor did she appreciate his habit of drinking a pint every 20 miles or so. "There is no excuse for so much slackness," she told him. "I have never in my life had to wait so long for a change." "We did not write ahead to arrange our journey," he said evenly,
as if holding his temper in check. "Therefore we must make do with what is available." "Do not raise your voice to me, young man. You have no call to use such a tone." Colonel Fitzwilliam looked an answer. "I am willing to pay," Lady Catherine went on. "Did you tell them that?" "Money will not provide horses that are not here. Fortunately, they are putting together a team, but such things take time." "The kidnappers did not have delays such as these?" "Because their journey was no doubt arranged ahead of time." He paused. "So, we're back to chasing kidnappers, are we? I thought we were rushing to beard Darcy in his den of bawdry iniquity." Lady Catherine narrowed her eyes at him. "Drink your beer, Hudson," she snapped, and put up the window. As soon as her clothes were dry, Elizabeth emerged from the back room, fully dressed. She needed only slight help to do up the buttons. These Darcy fastened with earnest care. This would perhaps be his last opportunity to be of help to her. To be Galahad. There was constraint in her manner, a thing that perplexed Darcy. He watched Elizabeth pull on her shoes and cloak and tie the ribbon of her battered bonnet. She was going out. Everything within him cried out to join her, to attempt an apology. "I am sorry for burning your note. If you loved me, I would have cherished it. But as it stands—" To say such things would only embarrass her further. Without a backward glance, Elizabeth went out of the house. This was not the time for conversation, nor should he be caught watching her at the window. Into the bedroom Darcy went, both to tend her fire and to check for draughts. All but one of the windows were stuck fast. To have one open might help the fire to draw properly. Darcy forced up the sash and then hunted for a spent candle. He'd learned from his workmen that wax, when rubbed into the interior frame, would keep a sash from sticking. As he worked, questions pushed their way forward. What was the extent of Elizabeth's friendship with George Wickham? Was she in love with the man? Would she forgive him for parting Bingley from Jane? And what of Elizabeth's disappearance from Hunsford? What had her family been told? Was there any way to shield Elizabeth's reputation from harm? And then there was the matter of escaping from the island and dealing with his aunt. Once Darcy finished with the sash, he pulled it down and locked the window. The room was in good order. It spoke volumes about Elizabeth's character that she was not dependent on a maid. Darcy returned to the front room, added more wood to the fire, and stood gazing into the flames. A lovely base of embers sent heat radiating into the room. What he wouldn't give for a nap. Or something to read, or, better yet, simply to be able to speak with Elizabeth. A glance to the window showed that she continued to pace back and forth before the lake. Eventually, either the weather or the setting sun would drive her into the house. It would be less awkward if she came in while he was engaged in a task. The pillow and blankets he'd used last night were temptingly stacked in the corner. He could make a bed near the hearth, rather like the little cinder girl. Darcy pushed this thought aside and hunted up the pack of playing cards. He brought a chair to the table and slowly began to lay out a game of patience. A stiff breeze tore at Elizabeth's skirts and sent her cloak to flapping. She drew it more firmly about her. If she returned to the house, she would be forced to face Mr. Darcy. It was easier to suffer shame and mortification here, in the cold. How could she have misjudged Mr. Wickham so completely? He seemed so sincere, so charming and plausible, and like a fool she was taken in by his lies. She, who prided herself on being such an astute judge of character. Fine judgment. And here she was, captive with a man whose character she had thoroughly misunderstood. Yes, he was proud and stubborn and opinionated, but was she not very much the same? How could she have guessed that Mr. Darcy could be so kind?
In a moment of weakness, she had called him Galahad. Heavens! What must he think of her? Presently rain stung her face. If she did not return to the house soon, she would again be drenched, which meant wearing his nightshirt while her dress dried. She could not face that. When Elizabeth came into the house, she found Darcy curled up near the hearth with a blanket. He was fast asleep. Her steps stilled. She must not wake him. Nor should he catch her watching him like this. Even so, Elizabeth could not tear her gaze away. Sleep softened his appearance, a marked contrast to his usual solemnity. The purple bruise along his jaw was healing. She could just make out a greenish tint. The circles beneath his eyes were darker than she realized. Mr. Darcy had suffered. He was likely suffering still, and yet he did not complain. And he was beautiful. The sculpted line of his cheekbone, his dark lashes against his cheek, the stubble on his chin. Even in a disordered, vulnerable state, he was amazingly handsome. What if she had not refused this man? What if, together, they had brought the news of their betrothal to Lady Catherine? During the emotional tempest that followed, he would have stood by her, solid and unwavering. She knew that now. Not that she was wrong to refuse him. His assumptions about Jane were unspeakably flawed. And yet, to be honest, she herself had been wrong. About George Wickham, of all people. Mr. Darcy had as many reasons to dislike her as she had to dislike him. But he had chosen to be kind. Was this then the moment Elizabeth had feared? Could she forgive him? Not that he deserved her forgiveness, not that she deserved his. Here was an unexpected thought. Perhaps, without realizing it, she had already forgiven him. It seemed her reasons to be angry were no more. A stray curl hung across his forehead. Elizabeth reached to smooth it and drew back just in time. What was she thinking? A log on the fire gave a sharp pop. Mr. Darcy shifted in his sleep. He must not awaken and find her here. And yet, to gaze on him was unexpectedly pleasant. Again the question presented itself. What would it be like to be this man's wife? Here he was, sleeping on the hearth instead of insisting on using the bed. Never once had he hinted or insinuated. George Wickham, on the other hand, was all about insinuation. If he were here instead of Mr. Darcy, would he behave even half as honourably? Elizabeth knew the answer. Mr. Wickham would have thrown up his hands and claimed that marriage was inevitable. He would then laughingly insist that they take advantage of the situation and share the bed. Wretched man! Shamelessly he'd exploited her youth and inexperience simply for his own amusement. She had readily believed his enticing half-truths. How she had wronged Fitzwilliam Darcy! Was there a way back? Could she undo the hurt she caused? I was wrong, she whispered to Mr. Darcy's sleeping form. Not that he could hear her, but it was something to say the words aloud. The firelight cast a warm glow on his handsome face. Oh, to trace the line of his jaw with gentle fingertips, to plant a kiss just there on his pale cheek. Wasn't it strange? Never once had she wished to kiss George Wickham. Should she risk it? Great heaven! What was she thinking? He might awaken, and then... And then what? She couldn't bear to think of how embarrassed she would be. For Elizabeth now knew something else. She would not be content to kiss Fitzwilliam Darcy's cheek. She wished to kiss his lips. Abashed, she drew back. Was this then the state of her heart? Was she beginning to love him? Could he somehow bring himself to love her once again? Darcy gave a sigh and shifted in his sleep. Elizabeth had remained here too long. As quietly as she could, she crept into the bedchamber and softly closed the door. Colonel Fitzwilliam pulled open the door of the coach. In the dim lamplight, there was no mistaking the weariness etched on his face. "I have bespoken dinner and a bedchamber for you, ma'am," he said stiffly. This news did not please Lady Catherine. "Do you mean we are stopping for the night? Impossible! We cannot afford to do so." "Of course we can afford it." "Stupid boy! What I mean is, we haven't the time." "My dear aunt, the sun set hours ago, and it has been raining ever since." "What care we for wind and rain? Perhaps after the next coaching stop—" "John has been at it all day. I cannot ask him to drive through the night, not in weather like this. We are stopping. Several hours of sleep will do everyone good." "But Darcy—" "He is either dead by the side of the road—" "Hudson!" "Or else he is snug at Grimstone House. Most probably the latter. In either case, our progress tonight will not make a bit of difference." "Of course it will. We must not be deterred by so paltry a thing as the weather." "You would not think so if you sat with us on the box." "It is a great piece of folly that you should choose to do so. There is plenty of room in here." He held out a hand. "You'll be better for your dinner. Come." "Have you engaged a private parlour?" "Yes," he said through shut teeth. "We shall be quite alone." Lady Catherine allowed him to assist her descent. "Excellent," she said crisply. "We need to talk over matters of business. Such as, for instance, the amount of money necessary to pay off a woman of questionable character." "Upon my word, ma'am, as if I would know such a thing." "But I think you do, Hudson," she said serenely. "You forget. I understand the workings of the male mind." As intended, this remark took the wind right out of his sails. "You understand what?" he demanded. "Better than even— Oh, never mind. You're mad, that's what you are." Lady Catherine did not bother to hide a smile. What she suffered in inconvenience was more than made up for by satisfaction. It was better, very much better, to take matters into her own hands. Chapter 14. Nothing of use was inside the closet under the stairs. Not shoes, or a coat, or even a cap. Fishing gear, a broken wall clock, and various odds and ends would do him no good. At the very least, Darcy was hoping to find a map. Hunting lodges always had one on a wall. Once again, his aunt's hirelings had been too thorough. He pushed the door shut and straightened. Even without a map, he must travel today. Had he delayed too long? He glanced to the window, dreading to hear the sound of coach wheels. At any moment his aunt could arrive, and then all would be lost. His careful planning would be for nothing. The trouble was, he did not like to leave Elizabeth alone. Yet under the circumstances, what choice did he have? Darcy's gaze swept the room. All evidence of his presence must disappear, meaning he either took his clothes with him or he must burn them. A pair of worn stockings had already been consigned to the fire. What else was he leaving behind? Confound it. He'd loaned Elizabeth a nightshirt. How could he wrest that from her? Darcy's gaze strayed to the bedroom door, which was closed. It was early morning. What if she were wearing it now? He felt heat rise to his cheeks. But the time. Should he risk it and knock? No. Instead, he would take his portmanteau down to the dock. Here was another problem. There had to be a way to transport his dry clothes across the lake without soaking them. The wooden crates that held their food would float, but not reliably. If only he could fashion a raft. There had to be something. Frowning, Darcy again studied the contents of the front room. Of course. This closet door. It would never support his weight, but it could keep his spare clothing dry. As he swam, he would push it along, or he could tow it if he could locate a rope. He had a supply of handkerchiefs, thanks to his busy aunt. He could knot them together. No, better yet, he had a half-dozen silk cravats. What had Aunt Catherine been thinking? Was he to dress for dinner each night wearing a fashionable cravat and so beguile Anne into matrimony, while Anne wore one of several party dresses? Clearly Lady Catherine was losing her sanity. And so, Darcy feared, was he. Now then, how could he remove the door without tools? If he had boots, he could kick it from its hinges. What about that chair? It would likely splinter to pieces, but would it do the trick? There were several iron pots. Hold hard, he could do better. The fire iron. A few solid strikes would be enough. And so they were. The splintering of wood was like music to Darcy's ears. One more blow to the left of the hinge, and then, "What on earth are you doing?" Darcy turned mid-swing. The bedroom door was now open. Elizabeth stood there, fully dressed, with her dark hair tumbling over her shoulders. Her hands were on her hips, but she was looking amused. It would do no good to gaze on her loveliness. "As you see, I'm removing this door," Darcy said shortly. "In one piece, if possible. Good morning." "Good morning to you. You have quite ruined the door frame. Your aunt will not be pleased." "My aunt can go to—" He stopped. "Yes? You were saying?" "My dear aunt," he said deliberately, "can go hang. If it would aid in our rescue, I would gladly burn this house to the ground." Why was Elizabeth smiling like that? Gad, she was adorable. "As a signal fire? Like castaways on a desert island. I never thought to imitate Robinson Crusoe." Darcy tightened his grip on the fire iron. He must not delay. And yet it was tempting to linger with her like this. When would he have another chance? But did it matter? Smile or no, she had made her opinion painfully clear. Darcy aimed another blow at the hinge. It felt good to batter this door, to have something to do other than regret his love for her. "I need a raft," he said, "to float my portmanteau across the lake. This should serve the purpose." "What do you mean? I don't understand." Darcy wrenched the closet door free. "I have miles to cover today, and a change of dry clothing will be helpful. So would a map. I was hoping to find one in the closet. Dartmoor prison is not far off, if our abductors are to be believed." "You would seek help at a prison?" Elizabeth was now sceptical. "Besides, that door is rather small. I doubt it would hold even one of us." "It isn't meant to. I'll manage easily enough." "You do realise that I cannot swim? As if anyone could endure that icy water." Darcy lifted the door and carried it to the front of the room. "I can. You will remain here in the house." "Alone?" "Certainly not." He set the door against the wall. "There is food to last another week, and enough wood for the fire. You'll be safe enough until help arrives." "But I do not wish to be left alone." "I know, and I'm sorry. Nevertheless, it is of crucial importance." "I do not see that at all." Darcy gave a sigh. "We went over this yesterday." "We did no such thing." "Did I not tell you that all evidence of my presence must disappear? When Lady Catherine arrives, you must be discovered alone." "But if I were never here, it would fit into a plausible account that Lady Catherine could tell others." "In other words," said Elizabeth, "we assist your aunt to cover her despicable plot with a lie." Again Darcy sighed. "Our goal," he said quietly, "is to preserve your reputation. You were mistaken for an heiress, kidnapped from her estate and held for ransom. This central truth serves as the foundation." "The foundation for what? Then, having discovered my true identity, my captors simply abandoned me? That is ridiculous." "It is, but it's a story that will satisfy your family and friends. More to the point, you will not be discovered with me. Never mind the fact that I shall be infamous. I'm hoping that you will become an object of pity. Whose pity? Not your aunt's. She will likely leave me here to starve. She would never— Darcy stopped. He'd not thought of this. Surely Lady Catherine would not— could not— Elizabeth lifted an eyebrow. I'll send someone to check on you. If you survive, how are you planning to walk for miles in freezing weather without shoes? I'll manage. Elizabeth went to the table. This is a pointless discussion. You are not leaving. And now, if you do not mind, would you kindly fill the kettle for tea? Darcy said nothing. She busied herself with slicing bread. I'll start on our breakfast. There are plenty of eggs, as I recall. This loaf will do nicely for toast. Our breakfast. How easily she said that. As if they belonged together. He must not linger, no matter how his poor heart ached to savour the sweetness of this moment. He had hoped to love her less, but he loved her more. The isolation had only increased the strength of his feelings. He must go now, before he lost his nerve. He could carry the portmanteau with one hand and his makeshift raft with the other. Farewell, he said gently. May God himself be your protector while I am away. Elizabeth turned, bread knife in hand. Her chin came up. I shall send someone to check on you, said Darcy. I promise. Neither of us have money, and you'll need to pay whomever you send, if I agree to be left behind, which I shan't. I'll pawn something. My signet ring will serve. Aunt Catherine's hirelings must have been told to leave that alone. A family heirloom? Surely you cannot— Darcy interrupted. It's gold, Elizabeth, and if gold will ensure your safety, so be it. I can have a copy made. No one will know the difference. No one but you. Darcy ignored this and gave a final look to the room. I think I'm set. Except I, loaned you one of my nightshirts. May I have it, please? She was still holding the knife, and now her eyes were narrowed. Why? I need to bring it away with me, or else burn it. No, it is of fine cotton lawn and quite comfortable. Why should I give it up? Heavens, was she blushing? He certainly was. Suit yourself. See to it that Lady Catherine does not find it. Darcy took up the closet door and his portmanteau. Unbolting the front door was awkward, but he managed it. You cannot leave now. It's snowing. He turned. This is April. It does not snow in April. Suit yourself, she scoffed. But there was snow when I looked out earlier. Darcy paused, gave her a quelling look, and pulled open the door. The sight of swirling snowflakes stopped him in his tracks. Wonderful, he spat. Just wonderful. He crossed the threshold and resolutely made for the dock. Elizabeth dropped the knife and followed. You cannot walk across miles of frozen ground in your stocking feet, she called out. You'll lose your toes to frostbite. As if that matters, he flung back. But, he swung round. Blast it all, Elizabeth. Do you not understand? I cannot be found here with you. And the ground is not frozen. The snow is only in the air. Darcy adjusted his hold on the closet door and stomped across the rough terrain. He stubbed a toe, but bit back a yelp. He would not give her the satisfaction. Elizabeth was hard on his heels. Galahad would never abandon a damsel in distress. Galahad would never have allowed himself to be kidnapped, he retorted. Nor would he be embroiled in an execrable dilemma like this. Should I instead call you Lochinvar? But no. Lochinvar cared nothing for fair Ellen's reputation when he stole her from the wedding. So daring in love, so dauntless in war, Darcy muttered, quoting Scott. He'd been daring in love, all right. And Elizabeth's scorn was the result. He loved her as much as she loved him, Elizabeth insisted, and yet her father wed her to a cowardly brute. So Lochinvar carried her away on his charger without concern for what anyone thought. Poetry is not meant to be a guide for life. Why ever not? As you said yourself, Lady Catherine and her fine opinions can go hang. Return to the house, Elizabeth, said Darcy wearily. You'll catch your death out here. As shall you. There was no point in arguing. He hadn't the strength. He reached the end of the dock and knelt to float his makeshift raft on the surface of the water. Fortunately, it supported the weight of the portmanteau. Darcy began to unbutton his frock coat. Now what are you doing? Are you still here? I thought I told you. It's freezing, and yet you are removing your coat. I cannot swim while wearing this. Carefully, Darcy added his coat to the raft. He began to unbutton his waistcoat. He heard Elizabeth's gasp of astonishment. Upon my word! Will you remove all your clothes? No, only these. You intend to swim all that way? I do. You'll never make it. I thank you for the vote of confidence. Fitzwilliam Darcy, she said at last, are you always this stubborn? He had to smile. He could not help it. This is hardly a new revelation, is it? Snow swirled round them. Elizabeth hugged herself against the cold. Go back inside, said Darcy gently. Comfort yourself that you are escaping an unhappy future. You are leaving me to face your aunt's wrath alone. What can be worse than that? Until death do us part is a long time to be miserable, Elizabeth. Who said I would be miserable? You did. Elizabeth laid a restraining hand on his arm. If you truly loved me, you would not abandon me like this. It was as if her fingers burned through the fabric of his shirt. Darcy could not bear her touch. He roughly pulled away. Please, don't. Surprise was in her eyes. And pain? No, that could not be right. She was merely sorry for him, in the way one pitied a suffering animal. Very well then, go, cried Elizabeth, since you are determined to be rid of me. If only this were true. Do you think this is easy for me, loving you as I do? There. He'd said it. And why was he shouting? Yes, I am stubborn, he fairly growled, and I never claimed to be Galahad. The best I can do for you, Elizabeth, is to give you your freedom. What if I do not wish to be free? What if I have changed my mind? He shrugged out of his waistcoat and threw it down to the raft below. You'll think better of it presently, my dear. Stand clear if you do not wish to be splashed. I've always found it easier to jump straight in. Fitzwilliam, no, you mustn't! Elizabeth's eyes were pleading. Nothing is worth this sacrifice. Darcy steeled his resolve. She was right. The shore was farther away than he thought. It would be a challenge to reach it. He sent up a silent prayer for strength. Feet first. That was the best line of attack. If the lake was shallow here, he would soon find his footing, and then plunge ahead into deeper water. Darcy drew a long breath, bent his knees, and sprang. He heard Elizabeth give a cry. He did not realise that she had flung her arms around him until together he and Elizabeth hit the icy water. Chapter 15. Darcy's head cleared the surface of the lake, and his feet soon found the bottom. Thanks be to God, Elizabeth was nearby. She clung to him, coughing, a very good sign. At all costs, he must get her to safety. It's cold, she sputtered, so horribly cold. I know, love, he said, tightening his hold. I've got you. Are you hurt? No. You didn't hit the dock as you jumped? She shook her head. Put your arms around my neck and lean on me. I'll carry you. Darcy lifted her and pushed through the water toward the shore. This was no easy feat, for her skirts tangled in his legs. At last he was able to set her on her feet. He held her close against his chest. She was shaking from the cold,
and so was he. But no matter. She was safe. He shouldn't smile. They both were wet and miserable, and it was still snowing. But by Jove, what a turn of events! From deep within, a chuckle bubbled up. Elizabeth parted her wet hair and looked up at him. "Is that all you can do? Laugh?" "We are in the suds," as Fitz would say, "and there isn't a blessed thing we can do about it." "I'm sorry, Fitzwilliam. I couldn't let you do it. I just couldn't." "You'll hear no complaint from me. Save for the fact that every garment I own is soaked, and you are wearing your only dress." "But your dry clothes?" "My portmanteau has descended to Davy Jones' locker, or wherever bottom dwellers of a lake reside." "I didn't mean for that to happen." "There's no harm done. None at all. In fact, it's rather fun. When Aunt Catherine arrives, she'll find us inside, wrapped up in blankets, with all our clothes hanging on the line." "Oh, dear. You are certain you're not hurt? Here we go, then. I'll carry you inside. Thank God we have a nice fire going." At the fireside, Darcy had to struggle with the buttons at the back of her muslin gown and the knotted tie that held her stays. Sweet punishment. "I'll just go rescue my clothes before the current carries them to deeper water. Will you be all right for a few minutes?" "Yes, thank you." When Darcy returned, Elizabeth was wearing his nightshirt and Anne's pink dressing-gown. Wrapped in a blanket, she huddled at one end of the bedroom sofa. She indicated a pile of sodden clothing. "Will you take these outside and wring them for me?" He wrung out her dress right there and hung it on the back of a chair. "The water will ruin the floor," she protested. "Good," he said, grinning. "Lady Catherine deserves no consideration." "How horrid you are." He laughed and went out. When he came back, he wore a blanket over his chest and shoulders. Was she blushing? Darcy hitched the blanket higher and wrung out his shirt. Alas, the temptation to tease her was too much. He held up his wet shirt. "This should dry quickly, being of fine lawn, like my nightshirt." Elizabeth had the grace to laugh. "If I may ask, why were you reluctant to part with it?" She dipped her head adorably. "Because it is yours. And as you say, it is very fine." "So that is why you changed your mind about me, to keep my nightshirt?" Her smile became coy. "Indeed, yes. And also to have a new dress or two, for that one is quite ruined." She paused. Darcy knew that look. Smiling, he waited. "I never thought to marry for money, as you know, but now I see that money is quite convenient, although we haven't any at the moment, have we?" "Nothing of value, save for my ring." "Is it still snowing?" "I'll look." Darcy went out to the front room and parted the curtain. Immediately he stepped aside to avoid being seen. Here it was, the moment of reckoning. He watched as Fitz climbed down to open the coach door for his aunt, and only his aunt. Aside from the coachman, there was no one else. At once, Darcy returned to the bedroom. "My dear," he said quietly, "we have company." Elizabeth started up. "Lady Catherine?" "In the flesh. Her travelling coach just pulled up. She must have risked Sunday travel." "But, Fitzwilliam, I am not dressed for callers, unless I squeeze myself into one of Anne's ridiculous party dresses, but the buttons will not close at the back, and my ankles will show." Darcy could not help but smile. Everyone knows that a man is seduced by ankles. "Oh, you. And yet you might have something there." Darcy's smile grew wider. "A very good idea. Better than good. Brilliant." "Why do I not trust you?" Darcy's gaze returned to the front room. "I believe our enemy, the lake, is about to become our friend. It will take time for my aunt and Fitz to row over, if Fitz can remember how to row. Perhaps one of the coachmen does. Lady Catherine wouldn't dare bring a witness across. It will be just the two of them. We have perhaps 5 minutes." "To do what?" "To set the stage for a grand melodrama." "It will be all that and more.
Lady Catherine will tear me to shreds. I think not. We have the upper hand. I most certainly do not. I am wearing only your nightshirt and a blanket. Don't forget Anne's frilly robe. Darcy dropped to one knee before her and took hold of her hand. What say you, dearest Elizabeth? Will you have me for your husband? Her eyes were wide. Justice made him add, or perhaps you would prefer my cousin. Doubtless this is why Aunt Catherine brought Fitz along. Elizabeth put up her chin. I shan't be forced to marry anyone. I concur. But if given a choice— Darcy's voice softened. Fitz is a decent fellow, my love. I can see why you would choose him over me. But I do not want him. Will you think me shameless if I choose you? Darcy could scarcely breathe for joy. If the truth be known, she went on, I have been regretting my refusal for days. Have you indeed? He whispered. I am the happiest man alive. Now then, about my busy aunt who is determined to interrupt. Are you up to feeling brave? I haven't much courage left, but yes, if you are with me. Now and always. His smile widened into a grin. What say you to giving Lady Catherine a scare? Her eyes studied his face. How do you mean? You cannot climb back into your wet clothes. Thus we are left with you in a blanket, and me wet and half-dressed. Naturally, Lady Catherine will assume that she has caught us. Caught us? He lifted an eyebrow. Shall we treat her to a little scene? In flagrante delicto? Fitzwilliam, no! That would be cruel. She deserves to suffer a little, don't you think? It is most unwise to taunt her, for we would never live it down. Heavens, we shall never live any of this down. She hesitated. What did you have in mind? You remain here on the sofa, bundled in your blanket, and I take the role of seducer. Now then, let me see. No cravat, no waistcoat. I'll just put on my shirt again. It is only a little wet. Darcy shook it out and turned away from Elizabeth. Even so, he could feel her gaze on his bare back as he dressed. It was a struggle to get the shirt on, but the end result was perfect. It clung to his chest in a way that Lady Catherine would not appreciate. It was all he could do to keep from laughing. He tucked in the shirt and turned to Elizabeth. Now then. Sleeves rolled up? Yes, please, she whispered. Shall I put on my wet stockings? Does a fellow seduce a woman in stocking feet? Elizabeth answered with a gurgle of laughter. Agreed. No stockings. Next, Darcy contemplated the front of his breeches. She guessed his thoughts. Those must stay on, sir. Decidedly. But we are looking to scare Aunt Catherine. This should do it. He unfastened the top 2 buttons. Fitzwilliam Darcy! This daring touch pleased him immensely, given that seduction was not his forte. Now that the stage is set, he said, things become a little more difficult. For you. He hesitated. Do you, mind if I kiss you? I suppose that would be best, as we must keep up appearances. She was as shy as he was. Her next words confirmed this. I know nothing about kissing. So, you are in for a disappointment. Kissing is not exactly in my line either. Wait, you've kissed no one? Not even Wickham? No, certainly not. Why would I wish to kiss him? I could ask you about seducing chambermaids. Girls whose families I know, who have served us for years. Please, give me some credit for having morals. Besides, my father would have had my hide. I am one of the stiff and decent Darcys. Elizabeth dimpled. But not, I trust, with me. He settled beside her and gathered her into his arms. It was beyond wonderful to hold her like this. His lips touched Elizabeth's soft cheek, and he whispered, "Most definitely not with you." Lady Catherine climbed out of her coach. An awkward business. Her lumbago was acting up. Here was yet another crime to lay at Darcy's feet. So much inconvenience he had caused, simply because he would not do his duty. "There it is," she announced to Colonel Fitzwilliam. "Grimstone House, the scene of the seduction." He blew smoke from his cigar into the cold air. Lady Catherine looked at him with narrowed eyes. "Must you smoke?" "I am outdoors, Aunt." "Nevertheless, it is a filthy habit. Something you picked up in the army, no doubt. Your father would never tolerate such a thing. He, like any decent gentleman, prefers snuff." Colonel Fitzwilliam did not answer. He was studying the house on the island. In spite of her heavy coat, Lady Catherine shivered. There was a breeze, and it was snowing lightly. How typical of Dartmoor to be unobliging as to weather. "Someone's home all right, with fires burning. There is rising heat coming from the tops of both chimneys." Lady Catherine clicked her tongue. "Darcy, Darcy, how the mighty have fallen! I am thoroughly ashamed of you." Colonel Fitzwilliam flicked ash from his cigar and strode down to the dock. He stood at its end and gazed at the water. Lady Catherine picked her way toward him. This was a perilous task for a woman her age, given the uneven state of the ground. It was with relief that she reached the dock. Colonel Fitzwilliam continued to frown. "I wonder," he said, "why is the rowboat on this side of the lake?" She attempted a laugh. "You'll have to ask your cousin." "And what is that, in the water yonder?" He pointed. "It looks like fabric of some kind. White fabric with tailing ends. A shirt, perhaps." "What would a shirt be doing in the water? Shouldn't Darcy be wearing it?" "That is what I mean to find out. I'll be back shortly." "Just a minute, young man. I am coming too." She saw him hesitate. "That might not be the best idea, ma'am. Who knows what we'll find in there?" "Why, Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet, of course." "It could be vagrants. You know, gypsies and the like." "In this forsaken place? Don't be silly. Everyone knows gypsies are thieves and robbers. Out here there is no one to rob." "The boat on this side of the shore suggests the presence of others, who will likely return." "They shan't return while we have the boat. Kindly do as you are told. I do not intend to be left behind." "Very well, ma'am. Don't say I didn't warn you. I'll have my pistol at the ready." "Good gracious, you don't intend to shoot Darcy?" "Why are you so convinced that he is within?" This, of course, was unanswerable. "We are wasting time," Lady Catherine announced. "Help me into the boat, Hudson." "As I've said before, ma'am, I prefer—" "Yes, I know. When you cease to act like a foolish schoolboy, perhaps I shall call you Richard. Although why you prefer that name is beyond me." Lady Catherine gave him her hand and stepped down into the boat. It swayed beneath her weight. "I trust you are able to row?" "Yes, Aunt Catherine, I can row." "However deficient your education, I dare say your father provided boats for you and your brother. Boys are said to enjoy enacting naval battles and the like." "Naval what?" Colonel Fitzwilliam gave a grimace and tossed his cigar into the water. "How the mighty have fallen," he muttered. "Here we go, then." Lady Catherine squared her shoulders and glared across the water at the house. "And for goodness sake, hold on. I don't want you ending up in the water." "As if I would be fool enough to allow that to happen," she snapped. "Suit yourself." Colonel Fitzwilliam let go the painter and applied himself to the task of rowing. Chapter 16. The pounding on the front door was unsettling, to say the least. That his aunt could spoil even the most innocent of loving kisses only added to Darcy's irritation. "Shouldn't you answer the door?" whispered Elizabeth. He lifted an eyebrow. Even if this were a seduction, she went on, it stands to reason that after so many days we would wish to be rescued. Did he wish to be rescued? Darcy was no longer sure. On the other hand, she did have a point. He tucked a stray curl behind her ear and said, "Unless that noise is our captors returning. In that case, I would not be kissing you, but preparing to fight. Or better yet, run. But there is nowhere to run, not on an island." She paused. "Don't you think we ought to answer the door?" But Darcy was caught by her words. "Run," he repeated. "Yes, we would run. Do you know where your shoes are?" "They're by the fireplace, but—" Darcy sat up. "Put them on, and tie Anne's sash as securely as you can." She obeyed at once. "By God's provident hand, we'll pull this off. We won't wait like sitting ducks." Darcy rose to his feet, crossed over to the window and pushed up the sash. "We are leaving through the window?" Elizabeth's astonished smile was a delight to see. Darcy found 2 blankets and pushed them out. "Can you straddle the sill?" "I think so, but not without exposing my legs in a shameless way. Won't we be seen?" "Not from the front of the house. In one of my, Galahad moments, I patrolled the island as your guard, and I looked often toward your window." "Spying on me?" "Sighing with regret, more like." Darcy scrambled through the opening and then reached up to help her. "If we're quick about it, we can get clean away." Elizabeth struggled to keep her legs covered as she slid to the ground. The poor girl. Darcy was mindful to look the other way while she descended. "You're certain they cannot see us?" she whispered, adjusting Anne's dressing gown. "I'm positive." "Now then, run down to the lake," he said into her ear, "but carefully. We can't risk injuries from a fall. Follow the shoreline to the dock, get into the boat, lie down, and cover yourself with this." He pushed a blanket into her hands. "I'll be right behind you." She looked up at him with wonder in her eyes. He smiled. "We'll cast off before they can do anything about it." "Fitzwilliam, will we leave them here?" "Maybe," he laughed. "Don't look so shocked. This was your idea. Off you go now." Elizabeth did not need to be told twice. Hugging the blanket, she ran toward the shore. Darcy soon followed, scorning his bare feet and lack of a coat. He reached the dock just as she did. Into the rowboat they both tumbled. Lightning fast, Darcy untied the painter and cast off. The pleasant gurgle of water against the hull was the best sound he'd heard for days, aside from Elizabeth's loving declarations. "Are we free?" she said, breathing hard. "Free to negotiate. It's high time we gained the upper hand." Darcy tucked the blanket around her and then fitted the oars. He glanced back at the house. "I see Fitz hasn't been able to break down the door." "Poor Colonel Fitzwilliam. He'll hurt himself." "Right again," said Darcy. "Here we go. Time for our bravery test." He cupped his hands. "Fitz!" he shouted. "Ho there! Colonel Fitzwilliam, ahoy!" To say that Darcy's cousin was dumbfounded was an understatement. He gave a yell and ran toward the dock. Lady Catherine stood gaping like a fish. "There you are!" she shouted. "You ought to be ashamed of yourselves, carrying on in such a way." Down to the dock marched Lady Catherine. When she could see them more clearly, she gave a gasp that even Darcy could hear. "Merciful heavens! Where are your clothes?" Darcy dipped the oars and brought the boat nearer. He did not want his cousin to miss what would come next. "It happens that our clothes are in the house, drying. Miss Bennet put a stop to my foolhardy swim to shore, which is a very good thing, because—" "Swim?" shouted Fitz. "Are you daft? That water is freezing. Moreover, it's at least 5 furlongs to shore. My mistake. After being held captive for days, I misjudged the distance." "Captive, you say? You were held captive? Here?" This was from Lady Catherine. Darcy raised his voice. "Spare us the theatrics, ma'am. You planned this, right down to the smallest detail." "I? How could I do such a thing? The diagram of the stables in your sketchbook? It is no crime to draw pictures. The express messages coming to the house at all hours, your correspondence with the Archbishop of Canterbury. I had pressing legal and ecclesiastical matters to attend to, business that did not concern you. Your lackeys knew their business, all right, said Darcy. I was abducted before I took my morning ride. Elizabeth was seized in the rose garden. Good gracious! I am shocked. Do you hear? Shocked. The sanctity of Rosings has been painfully violated. By your design. You provided everything necessary for a week in isolation. Wood for the fire, food, blankets and bedding and clothing. We did wonder why Anne's clothes were sent instead of Miss Elizabeth's. Did you say Anne? Lady Catherine demanded. Not my Anne, certainly. Be thankful that Elizabeth was kidnapped by mistake, for I doubt Anne could have survived the journey. As you see, I still bear the marks of coercion. By this day, so you do, cried Colonel Fitzwilliam. He leaned over the edge of the dock. What happened, man? Elizabeth was also hurt quite badly, and that I find hard to forgive. When I think how she was drugged and tied up and pulled about— Impossible! Screeched Lady Catherine. You are lying! I gave specific instructions that you were to be treated gently, with every consideration— She snapped her mouth shut. Every consideration, said Darcy. Your idea of gentle treatment is widely at variance with that of your hirelings. Fitz turned on his aunt. You had them brought here and held captive. Why? Isn't it obvious? Darcy did not bother to disguise his scorn. Lady Catherine could stand no more. It is your fault! Yours! She hurled at Darcy. You would not do your duty. You ought to have married Anne. It was arranged years ago, as well you knew, and yet you did nothing, year after year. Confound it, ma'am, cried Fitz. This is not the Dark Ages, nor are we Byzantine. By that reckoning, and my mother's, I ought to marry Cousin Clara, and that is something I'll never do, not in a million years. Poor Cousin Clara, Darcy heard Elizabeth whisper. So you arranged this, Fitz went on. You brought them here in an effort to compromise Anne and force a wedding. I find that despicable. So would Anne. She would have Darcy as her husband, snapped Lady Catherine. That is the material point. An ignoble means to a miserable end. If you won't have your mother's niece, said Lady Catherine, then you can have no objection to Elizabeth Bennet. What? Shouted Colonel Fitzwilliam. Me marry Miss Bennet? Why the devil would I do that? We're pawns on her chessboard, called Darcy. You are to play the role of the desperado. Sacrifice myself to her schemes? Not on your life. Colonel Fitzwilliam gestured toward the boat. Darcy is obliged to offer marriage, not me. And unless I miss my guess, he has already done so. My humble proposal has been kindly accepted, yes. What? Shrieked Lady Catherine. I owe a debt of gratitude to Miss Bennet for saving the honour of my family. That would be the Darcy family, ma'am, not yours. We Darcys do not embroil ourselves in intrigue and abduction. How dare you speak to me in such a way? Darcy shot a significant look to his cousin. Fitz? He manoeuvred the rowboat nearer to the dock. Colonel Fitzwilliam's eyebrows went up, and then, very slightly, he gave a single nod. A swift movement of the oars brought the bow to collide with the dock. Colonel Fitzwilliam did not hesitate. Into the rowboat he dropped. It rocked from side to side, but did not ship water. Nicely done, remarked Darcy, bringing the gunwale out of Lady Catherine's reach. Her hands clawed the air. Come back, she howled. You cannot leave me here. Oh, can't we? Taunted Colonel Fitzwilliam. I see no impediment to your survival, Darcy called. There is wood for the fire and plenty of food, if you don't mind salt pork and dry bread and eggs. There is tea and a comfortable bed, and you can wear Anne's party dresses for amusement. It is unconscionable to leave an old woman alone and defenceless. You dare to be so vile.
You left them, shouted Colonel Fitzwilliam. Take a dose of your own medicine. Hudson, you'll pay for this. You get back here, or not another penny will you get from me. We'll send someone for you, Darcy promised, once Elizabeth is returned to her home. Lady Catherine gave a snarl of rage. Elizabeth laid a hand on Darcy's arm. You cannot be serious, Fitzwilliam. This is too much. It's only for 4 days, or 5, depending. One ill turn does not deserve another. We ought to bring her with us. Darcy felt his expression harden. What she did was intolerable. Yes, but consider. I ought to have a chaperone for the journey, to maintain as much respectability as possible. Otherwise, what inn would have us? I will be travelling without luggage or a maid, and you see how I am dressed. You look like a vagrant, having no stockings or shoes or coat. Darcy's lips would twitch. He must not laugh. His aunt deserved no mercy. But he also knew that Elizabeth was right. A vagrant, eh? He said, smiling in spite of himself. I rather like that. So do I, she whispered. I shouldn't be bringing this up, Fitz put in, but our dear, deplorable auntie holds the purse strings. We'll be at a standstill before we reach the next coaching inn. Darcy began to laugh. Plague and the devil take it. Very well, we'll travel with a termagant. Don't say I didn't warn you. He wheeled the rowboat and manoeuvred back to the dock. In the meantime, Lady Catherine had collapsed in a heap. Very well, Aunt Catherine, Darcy called. We declare a truce. We'll carry you home with us, but on our terms, not yours. Lady Catherine staggered to her feet and shook out her skirts. It's about time you behaved like a rational man. She straightened her bonnet. We'll come in and dry our clothes. Then we'll close the house and be off. Fitz, I hate to importune you, but you need to remain here to guard the boat. Lady Catherine gave a cry of protest. Darcy was unmoved. We 4 leave this island together, or not at all. Where to go next became the topic of conversation. It remained so, even as they piled back into the boat for the journey to shore. Lady Catherine was all for Hunsford, but Darcy insisted on Hertfordshire so that he could call on Mr. Bennet. From his seat in the stern, Colonel Fitzwilliam spoke up. There is another option, you know. It would involve a bit more travel. It's a good 300-odd miles from here, but it might be the best way to rescue Miss Bennet's reputation. Darcy slewed round in his seat. Why are you smiling like that? Out with it, man. Simply put, we make for the border. Elizabeth was beside Darcy on the middle seat. He heard her gasp. Scotland. It cannot be worse than what you've endured already, Colonel Fitzwilliam pointed out. When Miss Bennet returns to her family as Mrs. Darcy, all will be forgiven. Lady Catherine fired up. Do you seriously mean to cover shame with more shame? To be married out of hand is insupportable. A man of Darcy's stature does not elope. It's what you planned for Anne, was it not? I dare say she brought along a special licence for that purpose, Darcy remarked. It's a pity that the name cannot be changed, or we'd use it today. Lady Catherine gave a cry. Such a disgrace! Elizabeth pressed more closely against Darcy. What disgrace? Said he. You will be present at the ceremony, ma'am, to give your blessing to the union. And, said Colonel Fitzwilliam, they'll need a witness. In Scotland, do witnesses sign the register? I call that poetic justice. Lady Catherine sat in the bow, glaring at everyone. Never! I shall never give my blessing to this ramshackle match. Is that your final verdict? Very well. Darcy wheeled the boat and began to row back to the island. You dare to threaten me? This is no threat, ma'am. You've made your choice, so back to the house you will go. It's Gretna or the island, quipped Colonel Fitzwilliam. Time to pay the piper, milady. Elizabeth spoke up. That's enough, you two. There is nothing else to be done, Lady Catherine, but accede to their demands. You know how stubborn Mr. Darcy can be. I am not eager for the long journey to Scotland. Ha! Growled Lady Catherine. You're as besotted with him as he is with you.
Elizabeth's dimple appeared. "It so happens that I am. Nevertheless, we are grateful for your help in this matter, ma'am." She gave a sidelong look to Darcy. "Grateful," he duly echoed. "If we are ready to behave sensibly," Elizabeth went on, "shall we turn this boat toward the shore? It's freezing out here on the water. I dare say the wind never stops blowing." "We shall travel the length of England. I hope you know that," grumbled Lady Catherine. "Days of hard travel. I dare say my poor coach will be battered to bits."
"It's no hardship to me," crowed Colonel Fitzwilliam, "and none to our fair couple either. If all goes well, we'll pass through Exeter by noon, and then on to Bristol and the north." "We'll post an express to your family," Darcy told Elizabeth, "to explain the abduction mistake and announce my, honourable proposal. My aunt," he added grimly, "will add a personal word of greeting." "Might we send an express to poor Charlotte as well? She must be sick with worry." "But of course," said Darcy. "Lady Catherine will be delighted to contribute a special message, singling out Mr. Collins as the herald of our joyous news."
"I shall do no such—"
Darcy responded with a deft movement of the oars. The boat swung about to face the island.
"Oh, very well," grumbled Lady Catherine. "I suppose you also expect me to purchase the wedding ring. A waste of good money is what I say."
"It so happens that I have that detail in hand, Aunt. It's the one thing of value your brigands did not touch." Darcy lifted his hand from the oar to display his signet ring. Colonel Fitzwilliam began to laugh. "Well played, Darcy." Darcy's lips brushed Elizabeth's ear. "You won't mind being married with this, will you, my love?"
"Mind?
I should like it above all things."
"You would,"
muttered Lady Catherine.
"Well?"
She looked from one to the other.
"If we're to travel all the way to Scotland, we shouldn't loiter here. Surely you can row this boat faster, Darcy. Put your back into it."
Darcy and Elizabeth shared a smile. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "In this, I am delighted to oblige." The end. You have been listening to You've Got to Kiss the Girl by Laura Hile, narrated by Ruth Redman.